Welcome to Mr. Nightbleed. Tonight, in 7 disturbing incidents that happened in cemeteries on Halloween, we return once more to the edges of the living world, where laughter fades, fog creeps low, and the ground remembers every secret buried beneath it. These are the Halloween confessions of those who work among the dead, caretakers, night guards, and mourners who witnessed things no one should see when the veil between worlds grows thin at every account you'll hear. Tonight was reported by someone who swore it truly happened. Unsettling encounters in graveyards, where carved pumpkins went cold, bells chimed on their own, and voices called from freshly sealed tombs. My goal this month is to reach 3,000 subscribers. Almost 90% of you listen and disappear without subscribing. Don't be one of them. Join the darkness. Subscribe now. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what hour of the night it is for you. And if there's a cemetery near you that feels wrong on Halloween night, type its name below, because when the air turns colder and the world pretends to sleep, some graves remember that it's their night to wake. Kill the lights, silence the world, take a slow breath, and let us begin. The first thing I noticed that night was the way the sodium lamp over the chapel door kept breathing, like it had a pulse. The glow would swell and thin, making the wet stone look like it was exhaling. Somewhere to my left, water ticked from the tips of cedar branches and tapped the tin roof of the caretaker shed. I remember because I counted the rhythm to keep my hands steady. I'm a night caretaker at Green Hollow Cemetery outside town, and this happened during my last week on the job. I was finishing a stretch of overnight shifts because Darren, the guy who usually does it, broke his wrist clearing storm branches along the outer fence. I had my mag light clipped to my belt, a Motorola on my shoulder, the ring of brass keys on a carabiner that never sat quiet, and the Fisker's shovel leaned by the watch house door because we'd had a fresh burial that afternoon, and I liked to tamp edges if the rain cut channels down. The air tasted like pennies. The drizzle was just enough to slick the flagstones and bead on the brim of my cap. Fog pooled in the low parts of the grounds and hung in the yew hedges like breath that didn't want to leave. It started small. That's how it always does. In my first round, I went to check the north gate and found the padlock closed again. I had left it open earlier for Malik, our grounds guy who was supposed to swing by and grab the steel trimmer he'd left in the shed. Malik always tapped his lighter against his palm while he talked, a nervous metronome. He'd called at 8 saying he was on his way, then called at 8:20 to say he wasn't, that his sister needed the car. I left the gate open anyway because his stories changed, and I didn't want to listen to him argue in the morning. When I found the lock shut with the shackle threaded and the hasp turned toward the lane, it looked like the way Ms. Dwyer, our supervisor, did it when she made her meticulous rounds. She wiped her glasses every time she signed the log, like signatures fogged lenses. I flicked off water with my fingers, clicked the shackle, and it popped open too easily, like it hadn't actually been latched. That was the first thing. The second thing was the ledger. In the watch house, tucked under the window that gave you a view across the oldest headstones, we kept an old green-bound burial register for reference because the computer in the office was temperamental and hated humidity. I turned to my note from that afternoon where I'd written Lot 12B, name Irma Decker, date October 31st, and the time we'd finished covering. Only the date looked wrong now. It read November 1st. It was written in my hand the same slanted way I crossed the sevens. I rubbed my thumb over the ink and it didn't smudge. I told myself I must have just thought Halloween and written past midnight out of habit, even though the burial had been at 2 in the afternoon. The page looked slightly damp along the bottom edge, even though it was far from the sill. I pressed it flat and shut the book. Outside, rain hissed in the hedges. The chapel lamp thinned again and the dark felt briefly heavier, like a hand over your eyes. I did the watch route I'd learned by heart. North gate, down past the caretaker shed, around the family crypts, and then the long slope toward the mausoleum. Green Hollow's mausoleum is one of those blocky 1930s municipal things with granite steps that have been worn just enough that your boots find the same places generations of other boots found. I always had the same thought descending to it, that I wouldn't have chosen to build a place like that so low, where fog gathered and sound traveled badly. When my foot touched the first landing, I felt it, not in my ears at first, but in my teeth. A thin vibration that seemed to come up through the stone. I tucked my chin, holding my breath a second, and there it was, barely there. But present the way a headache sits behind your eyes even when you pretend it isn't. faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I swept the mag light across the big metal door. The rivets shone under the beam. The padlock sat the way it always sat. I read the tags on my keyring until I found the one stamped mouse. It had been filed down on one edge long before I started. When I put it in the lock, the teeth hesitated like they didn't like each other and then went in. I turned it and the big lock gave the soft, unwilling click of something that had been wet and was ashamed to admit it. Inside, the air is always a degree colder and a degree drier, with an old floral smell that never leaves even after every vase is empty. I walked down the central aisle and listened to the rain patter on the skylight. The mag light showed plaque after plaque, names and years and small quiet features only family would remember. I wasn't looking for anything specific. The humming, if it was humming, didn't get louder inside. It seemed to go quieter, like it preferred the steps. When I came back out, the drizzle gained a little weight. I clicked the light off and let the sodium lamps do their flat work. They made everything look like skin under a sick room bulb. I checked my radio by habit and got the friendly burst of static that never sounds friendly at 1 in the morning. I shouldn't say 1 in the morning like the night was already moving. It was just after 11. The watch house clock is 10 minutes slow and I never fixed it because I liked the way time can be bent. A little in a place like this. On the second round, the anomalies stacked in that mild, shrugging way that doesn't call itself a pattern until later. The lantern in the chapel entry wouldn't stay lit. It's not a real flame, it's an LED deal Mr. Dwyer insisted on after a wax candle scorched the lintel 2 years ago. I replaced the batteries last week. Tonight it blinked quick, bright, off. I tried 3 times. I finally set it down and watched the reflection in the glass door ripple with the drizzle. Somewhere down the path, a bell rope gave a small, guilty tremble. We don't use the bell anymore. It's from a time when people were afraid to be buried alive and ran lines into coffins, and some older families kept theirs for tradition. Our bell is decorative, the shallow bowl kind mounted in an iron bracket. The rope is rough and it sheds fibers if you squeeze it. When it moves on a wet night, you think draft, then mice. Then you notice the windows are closed and the door has an auto closer, and there is nothing left to blame. Something else, the plot map pinned above the desk. I use it to keep new grounds guys oriented. 2 names were duplicated where they had never been duplicated before. Yvonne Brickley appeared on 7D and 7F in blue ballpoint. My handwriting. I know because I cross my 7s and I straighten the tails on my Ys. Yvonne Brickley is on 7D. I laid that marker myself, the day after her service, and I remember because her daughter clipped a white ribbon to the U and asked if that was allowed. I stared at the second Yvonne and the little triangle that indicated her headstone and tried to remember if I had ever seen that exact patch of ground. I couldn't place it. The second triangle sat offline by a fraction, like someone else copied the map by eye when I wasn't there. Around midnight, I went back to the fresh grave to check the tarp. Rain likes to eat into the high side and slide. I tamped the lips with the shovel, felt the water soak through the knees of my work pants and smoothed my palm over the new sod. The earth felt warm under the plastic where the day's heat had been trapped. My maglite beam jumped a little against the brass plate at the foot because my hand was shaking. I kept thinking about the ledger date. I told myself to put the book out of mind and stick to physical things. On my 3rd pass by the mausoleum, the humming was there again, and I didn't have to pretend to feel it in my teeth. It was in the meat of the steps, a thin thread of sound that was steady enough to feel like a machine but too low to be anything in the building. I crouched and laid my flat palm on the granite. Cold bled up into my skin. The drizzle made a soft crackle on my jacket shoulders, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I keyed the radio and said, out of habit more than anything, "Base to Dwyer, you copy." I knew she was home. She checks in, though. Tonight I got a hiss, a small pressure of sound, and then the radio said my name. Not like someone called me. More like the syllables shaped themselves inside the static and fell out by accident. I said my name back. The static lost its shape. The rain around me sounded like someone brushing clothes on a hanger. I stood up and told myself it was some crosstalk. Sometimes the towers on the ridge pick up garbage from the highway, or kids with walkies, or the sheriff's office testing. In the shed, the steel trimmer leaned where Malik had left it, chain oiled, blade cover on. I pulled the starter rope once. I don't know why I did that. It coughed and died. I shut the choke and let it be. A drop fell from the brim of my cap to the concrete by my boot. The shed smelled like gasoline and wet rope. I wiped my hands on a rag that left gray on my fingers and looked at my keys because I had the sensation of being late for something. The brass mouse key caught the light and looked recently polished even though it was always a little dull. When I turned it in my hand, the teeth didn't match the memory of the teeth I'd been using for years. They looked shallower. I fitted into the watchhouse door and it slid in and wouldn't turn. I tried 2 other keys until the one stamped watch gave the gentle, familiar click. I stared at the brass mouse key like it had misbehaved. I told myself it was my hands, the wet, the cold. At 1:30 by my slow clock, I took the long loop past the outer fence. The lane there runs parallel to a line of elms that shed bark like bad paper. A fox crossed ahead of me, rust at the edges where the sodium light caught its fur. When I reached the north gate, the padlock was shut again, and this time I caught the lock body still trembling lightly as if it had just been turned. I pressed the metal with my thumb. It wasn't warm. The drizzle had made a skin of water over everything. Behind me, through fog and trees, the bell rope in the chapel moved once. Higher this time, a short, eager tug like someone signaling a friend who didn't know how to speak loudly. I walked back toward it, the ring of keys sounding wrong because I was thinking about them. The rope stilled before I touched the door. If you spend enough hours in a cemetery, you learn what is wind dressing up as meaning and what is meaning pretending to be wind. You learn the way sound travels flat over stone and doubles back on itself. You learn that rain makes a private language with every roofline. You also learn names you weren't trying to learn because you see them every day. I can tell you without looking where the Schmidts are, and how the Rojas plot line dips because of a sink years back, and how there is a hairline crack in the lintel over the Martins' crypt that doesn't widen because it doesn't know it should. That night, names had edges they didn't used to have. I kept seeing the same one on stones that shouldn't have had it. Brickley. At first I thought it was my mind being primed by the duplicate on the map. Then I was sure. On the way to the mausoleum, I passed 3 stones in different rows, different decades, with Brickley etched deep. I've walked those rows so many times that newness hurts my eyes. When I doubled back later, 2 of those stones had the names I remembered again. The third kept Brickley until dawn. At 2, Ms. Dwyer radioed a check. Her voice always sounds like she's swallowing a cough. "All quiet?" she said. I almost said the word hum, then didn't. "Fog's heavy," I said. "Northlock keeps pretending I shut it." She made a sound like a pen tapping paper. "I'll mark it. Put a note for maintenance." Then she said, after a small pause where I knew she was wiping her glasses and buying herself a moment, "You okay, Jonah?" I said yes a little too quickly. I told her I was heading to the mausoleum to reseat the padlock because the metal swells when it's wet. "Don't go messing around in there," she said. "You know the Brickley family is touchy about that wing." That's what she said. I didn't tell her I had written Brickley twice by accident, that I couldn't remember writing it at all. This is the part I keep replaying. The climb and the decision to go down again. The rain got heavier. Patient, not crashing, just gaining a certain weight that means it isn't going anywhere for a while. My jacket darkened to the shoulders. My breath came out foggy and hung lower to the ground than I liked. The mag light beam made a soft tunnel I was embarrassed to stand inside. The keys knocked against my thigh. At the top of the steps before the door, I stopped and listened. The humming was clearer now, and it wasn't in the air. It came from the stone itself, a thread running through, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. Inside, the echo muffled the rain and made my bootfall sound like someone else was walking at my pace near me. The skylight fogged. I traced the central aisle with the beam and counted doors. You don't count doors because you think the number will change. You count because names have a weight, and when you stack them too quickly, something in you wants to put them into piles. I reached the Brickley wing and aimed low, the way you do when you don't want to be the person who points a light directly at grief. The plaques were what I knew. Ruth, with the date they added a year after she went in because the family waited on an autopsy. David, with 3 coins glued crooked under his name. Yvonne. When my beam hit Yvonne Brickley, I realized the problem. The cold in that wing was wrong, the air a little too still even without a draft. The plaque wasn't mounted the same way as the others. It had a thin lip around it like a frame, and the screw heads were raw brass, not the dull oxidized tone of the rest. It looked new. That wasn't the part that made me put my hand against the stone to steady myself. It was the way the map triangle had been drawn for the plot outside and this plaque had been placed inside. Like the paper in the building had started disagreeing while I was looking elsewhere. I swallowed. tasted metal, and stepped backward until my shoulders found the cool wall. The radio clicked once without my touching it. The static didn't say my name this time. It said a word I couldn't make sense of until I realized it wasn't a word. It was a number said the way a mouth says a name, 12. I thumbed the button. Say again. The radio stayed shy. From the entry, Rain whispered fuller. I turned the mag light off to listen. The dark in there isn't total. Sodium light leaks in through the skylight and the little glass panes near the ceiling and makes everything look like an underwater scene. In that diluted glow, something down near the base of the central pillar looked damp. The stone near the floor was darker, a tide line halfway up like a shoreline mark. It's not possible for water to wick upward like that without leaving tracks below. I turned the light on and went to my knee. The granite was cold and very slightly vibrating under my palm. My hand found the floor seam where the first step meets the landing. The seam was clean, tight. I told myself there was a pump somewhere under there moving groundwater. I told myself anything that had a motor hum could be located and shut off. I stood, went back outside, and pulled the mouse key free. It slipped in, felt wrong again, but turned. I locked the door because I thought the action would make my head feel organized. When I walked back up the steps, the humming stayed with me for 3 steps longer than the stone should have allowed. The climax of it, if that's what you call a night that never lifts, began around 3. Rain held steady. My jacket felt like a wet newspaper, and my fingers had that numb clumsiness like they belonged to someone who was late for something. I did the slow loop and found the outer road washed shiny. I checked the tarp on the new grave and found it smooth. I went into the watch house to write a note about the gate, and my hand wrote the time as 4:17 on instinct. I looked at the wall clock, 3:17. The ledger sat where I'd left it. I opened to the page and saw my name signed for a round I hadn't done yet, with a timestamp that matched the one my hand had just written. Ms. Dwyer puts tiny dots under the tens place when she sees sloppy times. There was a dot under the 1. The paper was cold. I can tell you every smell in that room. Wet wool, old paper, a faint oily smell from Malik's trimmer that gets into everything. The radio on the desk gave a soft, regular breath of static, like it was rehearsing the word it wanted to learn. I took the plot map off its nail because the duplicate was bothering me. The pushpin made a sound like a tooth being pulled. The paper had weight, heavier than it looked. A little slick where hands had smoothed it for years. I laid it on the desk, and as I bent to bring my eyes close, a drop fell from my hairline and marked the paper on an empty square. The ink in my duplicate Yvonne was still crisp. I pressed the pad of my finger over it. The map didn't bleed. The hum was in my jaw again. I knew if I went outside I would hear it from the steps. I did. Only this time it was stronger. The kind of pure, thin tone that makes glass sing when you wet your finger, only buried and tired and low. On the second landing, my mag light shook in my hand, not from fear, not then, but from the cold settling into the small muscles. I set the light on the step with the beam angled so it grazed the door and showed any movement. I took the brass key ring off my belt and thumbed the mouse key and tried the lock. It turned hesitant, then gave. The handle was metal and wet, and the skin stuck a little. When I pulled, the door held like someone had braced their foot on the other side and put their shoulder against it. And then, with a sound like a breath coming off a window, it yielded. Inside, the air felt like the inside of a blown-out candle. The hum didn't live in there. It lived under there. I walked the central aisle with the light close to my chest. I checked the floor near the pillar. The tide line was higher. That's when I heard the other sound, the one I still don't explain even when I pick it apart in my head. A soft, patient dragging, not heavy, not cloth. The sound you get when you pull a rope through a narrow space and the fibers take their time. I traced it to the back, to the wall that faces the hill. There's a utility door back there with a keyhole nobody uses because the hinges were painted shut years ago. My ring has an old key for it. I have never found a door on the grounds that it fit. I fitted in the lock out of an impulse that came from deeper than thought, and the teeth seated like they had been waiting to bite that pattern again. I turned it. The lock clicked with a domestic honesty that didn't match the rest of the night. The door didn't open. The paint held. I felt heat rise in my face from the effort of keeping my breath slow. The dragging sound retreated, then came nearer, like a tide that learned the shape of a cove. I put my ear to the stone, nothing. Then the hum, not in my jaw now, but very lightly in the cartilage. I took the mag light down to the step and lay flat to put my ear to the seam. The stone smelled like old water and granite dust. The hum was there, and underneath it, a thread of something else, almost like a voice, almost like a person trying to find a note they hadn't used in a long time. I stood too fast, and my vision silvered at the edges. The radio breathed and then said 12 again, and then 13, and then, with a slowness that felt like a hand tracing letters on fogged glass, my last name. The light flickered against the plaques. The little coins under David Brickley's name made a sound like teeth when they shift. I set the beam on the floor and wedged it so it lit the seam. I took the Fiskars from where I'd leaned it by the door because part of me had brought it without deciding to. I told myself I was going to scrape moss off the seam, that I was going to prove it was just an echo chamber, some air channel fed by rain. I chipped at the mortar line. The sound of metal on stone is clean in a way bones and teeth feel. The seam gave me dust and a small grit that stuck to my wet fingers. The hum did not change. The dragging sound went away entirely, or else I convinced myself it had. I put the shovel down and placed both hands flat on the floor to feel. What I felt was not movement. It was waiting. That was worse. Something small hit my wrist. I flinched. The beam swung and ate up dark. A droplet had fallen from the skylight. Another followed, timed to the count the radio had stopped at. 12, 13, 14. I reached for the radio and turned the volume down because I didn't want it to be part of the rhythm. The moment I did, another sound took its place. The bell, one swing, enough to make the clapper touch and hesitate and touch again, the second blow softer than the first. I shut the mausoleum door and locked it because I was suddenly sure the night had too many openings. On the steps, rain stitched my shoulders. My breath came short like I'd been running even though I hadn't. The maglite beam shook enough that I brought it down and aimed it at my boots to steady my eyes. That was when I saw the mud on my laces and realized it wasn't the reddish soil from the new grave. It was the fine gray paste you get when you kneel on stone dust and water, which is exactly what I had done. The realization should have calmed me. Instead, it told me I had been putting pieces of a place back into itself, as if I had been practicing for a different job. The climb out of that feeling was slow. I went to the watch house, wrote the time on the log, signed my name carefully like I wanted it to look like me, hung the map back on its nail, and drank lukewarm coffee from a thermos that still tasted like last week's chili. The room ticked and breathed like rooms do when rain finds the joints of a building. My phone vibrated once with a weather alert that had come late through our dead spot. The clock said 4:10. The ledger said 4:20. I told myself I would make one last pass at 4:30 and then sit till dawn. When the moment came, it felt like I'd already done it. The outer road looked poured from tin. The tarps on the new grave were smooth as lake water. The chapel lamp breathed. The rope hung quiet, fibers swollen. At the north gate, the padlock sat open as if someone had left it for me. My fingers were swollen from cold and I turned the lock the wrong way once, then corrected. When I set the shackle, it felt loose, like setting a bone too quickly. I told myself to avoid the mausoleum. I told myself I'd done enough for one night. I walked the other direction and made it 6 paces before my feet found the turn. At the top of the steps, I stood still so the water could run down my face and not make me blink. The humming was there in the stone, thin as a thread, steady as a held breath. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I put my hand in my pocket and found the brass key. It had warmed from my body. When I took it out, the mouse stamp looked softer than it ever had, like the impression had been made in clay. I closed my fingers around it, and for a second I can be honest about now. I considered dropping it down the storm drain by the utility shed. I didn't. I went back to the watch house and hung it on its hook because that is where keys go, and because I wanted to be the person who followed simple rules. The radio gave a small sigh like a person rolling over in sleep. The rain thinned. Dawn comes here as a lighter gray. The sodium lamps turn themselves off with a grudging gasp. The fog lifts not because it wants to, but because the ground gives it permission. I walked the inner path a final time with a feeling like I had been let go by something that had been holding a part of my jacket between its fingers. The bell didn't move. The chapel lamp steadied and stayed. The names on the stones were the names I remembered. On the map above the desk, only one triangle had Yvonne Brickley again. When I opened the ledger to sign off, the times were in order. My signature sat where it should have. I felt foolish and grateful and tired in a way sleep doesn't fix. I locked the watch house, tested the door like I always do, and stepped out into a morning that smelled like wet leaves and wet stone. The north gate was open. I smiled in that annoyed way you smile when you know you're about to walk 70 yards to close something, and you are already off the clock in your head. I crossed the road, closed the gate, set the padlock, and checked it twice. Then I turned back and saw the faintest movement at the far end of the path. A person-shaped dark that made my shoulders tighten before my mind had opinions. It was only a moment. A trick of light. When I reached the path, there was nothing there but the cedar shaking off water. I told myself that was the end of it, that I had made it through the night in one piece and that what had wanted to do something hadn't found the words. I went to the office to drop the keys in the after-hours box. Ms. Dwyer had stuck a note by the slot. Remember to leave mouse key on hook. I thought about telling her she didn't need to write that, because I always left the keys where they belong. I looked through the watch house window at the hook where the mouse key was supposed to hang. It hung there, dull brass caught in the first honest daylight. I felt the weight of metal in my pocket, and for a moment I didn't reach for it because I already knew how much it would weigh when I set it down. I took my hand out of my pocket. There was no key in it. The after-hours box took my ring without the mouse key like it had taken them that way 100 times. I looked again at the hook. The key hung there and I could read the mouse stamp from 10 feet away. I stood until it felt like too much standing for a person whose job is to walk. In the corner of the window, the chapel lamp steadied once more and the rope hung exactly still, and the tiny hairs along my wrist lifted to the same low vibration I had pretended all night wasn't a message. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. What do you think of this story? Tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were there. I read every single one of your thoughts and some of them stay with me longer than I'd like. Now, let's move on to the next story, because what's coming next might be even darker. The first thing I noticed was the drip off the eaves of the watch house landing on the same patch of concrete, over and over, so steady it sounded like a clock. The second was the radio on my shoulder hissing in a thin, even thread, not enough to call it static, more like a breath someone was holding. A lamp out by the north path flickered and stayed dim, and when I cupped my hand over my mag light to shield it from the drizzle, my own palm shone back at me, wet and pale, as if I had reached into cold milk. I'm the night caretaker here, McKenna Cemetery, a rectangle of ground walled on two sides by brick and on two sides by chain link that bows in the middle where deer push it. This happened last month. During the week, I took extra shifts because Luis was out with a knee, and Nora, our morning clerk, kept apologizing for leaving the ledgers in a mess. I was already tired when I started that shift. The kind of tired that lays over your thoughts like damp cloth. Our rules are simple. Walk the paths, check the gates, make sure the chapel and shed are secured, and keep an eye on the mausoleum at the south end because people try to get in there at night. Usually teenagers. No one has a key to the inside crypt level anymore. That lock predates the office we work out of, and the city won't pay to drill it and rekey. The front door has a modern padlock on an outer hasp, and the inner door is original iron with a keyhole that looks like a fish mouth. I carry a ring with 23 keys on it, none of which fit that inner lock. I can tell you every shape of those keys by touch. There is a brass one, heavy with an oval bow and teeth like tiny stairs. It doesn't match any door, but I keep it because it came in an envelope glued to the ledger for Section H, and Nora wrote, "Old key, unknown," next to it with a smiley face she crossed out. I did my first loop. Drizzle needled through the fog. The sodium lamps lined the main road like burnt coins, throwing that cheap orange that makes everything look like a photograph from the 70s. You can smell metal on nights like that, from the wet fence and the rusted bolts on the gate hinges. I checked the northwest corner where the chain link sags and found the little bungee cord we used to cinch the cut section tight was back on. I had taken it off during the day to force the grounds crew to patch it properly, and I pocketed it so they'd have to sign out a new one. Now it hung there taut, hooked exactly where I always hook it. I took it off again and put it in my pocket. I remember thinking, fine, I'll hide it in the watch house this time. In the caretaker shed, I did the usual glance over the steel trimmer, the gas can with the hairline crack someone taped, the Fisker's shovel with the splintered handle we keep meaning to replace. I tested the door latch twice because it likes to catch halfway. When I stepped back onto the path, I could hear, faint and regular, water ticking off the wrought iron fence around the veterans section. I told myself the wind would be gone by midnight and the fog would settle down into a blanket. Because that's what Nora says when she wipes her glasses with the edge of her cardigan and squints up at the trees. She's always wiping her glasses even when they look clean. My radio crackled once, then quieted. We keep it on a closed channel, so all I get are calls from the old dispatcher desk if they think I forgot to log a pass. I clicked the button and said, South Walk 1053, just to put something in the ether. It's better when there's sound, even if it's your own. Near the chapel, I turned my light on a headstone so I could write the name down. I keep a list of stones that need cleaning or resetting and give it to the grounds guys, because they take it more seriously when it comes from me. This one was for Prentice Hale, 1949-2008, and the 0 had a chip that made it look like an 8. Behind it, the ground was damp and dark in a rectangle, darker than the rain should have made it, and when I pressed my boot heel in, the soil gave. We hadn't had a burial in that row for 6 months. I checked the ledger with the little pencil I keep in my jacket. Prentice Hale had been moved last week, it said. Moved? Written in Nora's hand, then crossed out and corrected to reset, then corrected again to no action. 3 lines, 3 corrections. I made a note to ask her in the morning. The drizzle made the pencil wobble. By the time I made it to the south end where the mausoleum sits, half in the open and half under the low slope of a hill, the lamp there was buzzing. It's newer than the others, white LED, but when the transformer inside hums, it sounds like insects trapped in a jar. That's the best way I can put the feeling of that corner. The air is colder by 3 or 4 degrees, and it presses at your ear like you're about to go underwater. On the 4th step of the entrance, the one that dips toward the left, the water pools into an oval no matter how the wind blows. It was there when I took this job, and it'll be there after I leave. I stood there to listen to the rain hit the stone and noticed something below the noise of the lamp and the drip. A tone, low and thin, humming beneath the steps. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I told myself it was a resonance from the transformer mounted on the lamp. If you put your hand on the metal pole, you can feel it buzzing. I also told myself I'd heard it before and just didn't mark it. When you're alone with your hearing for 8 hours, you learn what to ignore. I rattled the outer padlock on the mausoleum door. It was secure. The inner door's iron spoke through the wood like it was colder than anything else around it. 5 small things stacked up after that. Not all at once. I signed the watch house log at 11, and when I flipped back to see how far back the pages ran, I found my name in there for a shift I hadn't worked yet. It was written in my looping block letters with the slanted T I don't like but always do. The date was today. The time was 7:03 first pass. I looked at my wristwatch and it read 11:06. I told myself Nora must have copied times from the radio log to catch me up when I took Luis's hours. I left a note. Nora, did you backfill? Jay. On the radio, which had been quiet, I started getting the hint of a word in the static. It was like the way a song gets stuck in your head and you keep fitting syllables to it, until something snaps into place. The syllable was down. It came every time I crossed the main road where the water makes a little river into the drain between sections D and E. Down, like a breath on the last letter. If you stood still and listened hard, you could almost convince yourself it was wind striking the antenna. The bell rope in the chapel moved when I passed the door. We keep the chapel locked, but the rope hangs into the entry, and if the door is ajar, the rope will sway when someone walks by because the air shifts. The door was shut. I still told myself I had made it swing on my first pass, and it had only now settled. The rope is thick and coarse, and it leaves a pattern on your palm if you grip it. I didn't touch it. Back at the shed, I tried the key on the west side door because sometimes the lock binds from swelling. The key, that small square-headed one we use on the shed, went halfway and stopped like it had hit bone. I took it out, turned it, tried again. The teeth grated, bit, then refused. I tested it in the front door. It slipped in smooth and turned. I wrote down West Shed lock sticky and put it on the clipboard. Later, when the grounds crew came in, Luis would tap his smoke against his thumbnail and say he told me that lock was trash. He taps his lighter when he's thinking. He doesn't even look at it. He just taps it, tap, tap, tap. At midnight, I did a pass on the outer gate road. The big gate there faces the street and we keep it chained. The chain is supposed to cross left over right because the left side is higher. It was right over left, neat as a diagram. That's the thing that made the hair lift on my forearms. Not because the chain was different, but because people rarely make something wrong look perfect. I fixed it and made sure the lock clicked. When I turned back toward the interior, the fog sat at the level of my belt, thick and glowing in the lamplight, and I had to lift my knees to feel like I was walking through something, rather than in it. On the hill above the mausoleum are 4 stones with the same last name, 10 years apart from each other. Nothing remarkable. That night, every time I walked by them, I noticed the second stone. The one for Margaret looked like the letters had been traced and retraced. I got close and saw it was my light making the water glint. But when I moved the beam, the name seemed to repeat in the shadow behind the letters like a palimpsest. Same lines, deeper, newer, not more worn. Margaret, Margaret. I put that down to tiredness too, and wrote it in my pocket notebook with a question mark. I had 2 pages full of question marks by then. At 2, I went back to the mausoleum because the rain had picked up, and the path by the south wall always floods if I don't sweep it toward the drain. The steel trimmer leaned where I left it, its string head beaded with water. The Fisker shovel looked like a soldier at ease. The wind had shifted and the buzzing of the lamp had flattened out to a line. I stood on the 4th step again and the hum was there. Stronger, I think, or closer. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. It felt like something you could put your tongue on. A note held in a person's throat. I turned my light off to listen better. The dark came all at once. I don't know why that surprised me. I had been looking straight at the beam, so maybe I expected my eyes to carry some of it. The rain sounded louder without the light. The hum was steady, uninterested in me. I did the one thing you're not supposed to do and put my palm on the stone like someone asking a question. The chill shot up to my elbow. The hum did not change. I told myself to find the transformer and rule it out. I walked the pole and put my ear on the metal and heard a different sound. The solid, busy thrum of electricity. Nothing like the note under the steps. I told myself, fine, it's drainage. A pipe under there catching the rain, the old brick channel from when this place had a pump. I remembered the brass key in my pocket. It was heavier that night. I don't know how a small piece of metal can feel like a full pocket, but it did. Around 3, I went into the watch house to top off my thermos, and the radio hissed and popped, and a voice that was not a voice clicked in. Cracked and stuttered the word down twice. I wrote the time and the word in the log. When I turned the page, someone, me, had already written it there next to 304, neat and dark like the pencil had been sharper earlier. I pressed my thumb on it. The graphite smudged. I looked at my own hands and they were wet and cold. At 3:30, Nora called in. She doesn't work nights, but she has insomnia. And sometimes she rings the desk to remind me to lock the chapel because a reporter came once and left a tripod in there, and the grounds crew almost mowed over it. Her voice sounded too bright for the hour. She said, "You okay?" And I said, "Fine," and she said, "Bring the Section H ledger when you come in. I think I filed a page in the wrong book." And then she lowered her voice like we were conspirators and said, "I keep seeing a grave date in there that doesn't exist. Don't tell me which one, I want to see if I'm seeing it again in the morning." That was Nora, always turning mistakes into experiments. She wiped her glasses on a cloth near the phone that she swore made them clearer. I took the Section H ledger off the shelf. The paper smelled like dust and wet cardboard. There was a loose page tucked into the back with a smudge where an envelope might have been. The brass key slid out and tapped the table. I held it up and the overhead light struck it flat. It had a number lightly etched into the bow, 17. I had never noticed that number. 17 is the number of the step if you count from the gate to the base of the mausoleum platform, not counting the landing. I went back out because once you notice something like that, you can't unsee it. The rain turned from needles to threads. The fog hung in sheets. At the south end, the lamp hummed, and the hum under the steps met it like 2 notes trying to become one and failing. I put my hand on my radio and told the desk, "South end, 348. It clicked back nothing. I walked the 17 paces from the chain gate to the base of the platform, slow, counting on my fingers because I didn't trust my mouth. At 17, my boot hit the shallow dip that only shows up in the dark when you're looking for it. I swept my light across the step and saw nothing different from any other night. I knelt and let the water soak through my pants and felt with my fingers along the edge where the step meets the riser. There was a seam, maybe a finger's width. It's always been there. I pressed the brass key against it because that is how the thought arrived in my head. Not like an idea, but like a hand turning my wrist. The key fit the seam like it had been measured to it. I didn't unlock anything. There wasn't a lock in the seam. But when the metal touched the stone, the hum picked up so slightly I would swear later it was imagination. I pulled the key back. The hum softened. I touched it again. Stronger. Not loud, not a sound you'd jump at in a movie. It felt like a throat clearing after a long silence. The drizzle felt colder. My breath came out in thin white wires. I stood and backed away because I didn't like feeling compelled. And I've done this job long enough to know that when an object starts to ask something of you, you set it down and give it no answer. The climax of that night, if I have to point to a part and say here, was between 4 and 5. The lamps hit their sickest color then. The fog holds on the lowest branches of the oaks. We had a funeral coming in the morning. Hartley infant, no age listed, just a date. And the grounds crew had set the grave tent poles in the afternoon. The canvas was folded and strapped on the frame, and the ropes lay coiled on the ground like gray snakes. I walked by to make sure nothing had blown loose. The rope ends were wet and darker than the rest, and when I picked one up, it left a clean line on my palm. On the tent frame, there's a little brass plaque the company rivets on with their logo. It had a smear on it, like someone's thumb had pressed hard and dragged. I wiped it with my sleeve and the mark didn't go. I leaned in. It wasn't a smear. It was the number 17 scratched shallow into the brass, same hand or style as the key. It wasn't there in the afternoon, or if it was, I missed it. I put my hand flat on the table in the tent space, and the wood underneath felt like the top of a piano when someone plays in the room below you. I don't play piano. That's what it felt like. I told myself to go inside the chapel and warm up. The chapel is small. Wood pews, a simple altar, a bell rope, and a smell like old hymnals and damp wool. The door key turned fine. When I opened the door, the bell rope swayed not like it had been hit by a draft, but like someone had just let it go. The chapel is sealed enough that drafts don't move that rope. I stood still and waited for the room to settle. The only sound was the drip-wicking noise of wet clothes. Mine, and a faint tick from the baseboard heater that never actually heats. I pointed my mag light at the floorboards because I remembered the maintenance note from 2 winters ago that said something about rot near the altar. The beam jittered slightly because my fingers were cold. The floor by the front pews was darker, but that's varnish and age. I heard the hum again in there like it had come in with me. It had an angle in that room, a direction, centered under the steps that descend to the tiny cellar where we keep spare folding chairs. I don't like that cellar. It's barely a crawlspace brick and it smells like wet nails. The key felt warm in my pocket. I crouched by the hatch and lifted it. The hinge creaked and the creak echoed in the hollow below. I used my flashlight to sweep the brick. There was no movement down there, just the slow shine of water on mortar. I put my head in enough to see the base of the steps. The hum was stronger, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. It did not make sense that I could hear it there. The mausoleum is across the path up the rise 60 yards away. I pulled back and shut the hatch and sat on the front pew because my legs felt slow. I counted to 100 under my breath. At 90, the radio hissed and said down again, not a voice, but not nothing. In the quiet afterward, I heard the bell clapper shift once against the side of the bell in the tower. It's not easy to make it do that without pulling the rope. I stood and put my hand on the rope just to feel something solid. The rope was damp. It smelled like old smoke. At 4:30, I decided to call the dispatcher and log a noise complaint, which is what we do when we need a paper trail for something we can't categorize. My hands had that tremor that comes with cold. The desk phone rang, and the night guy John finally picked up sounding like he'd been halfway through a crossword. He said, "McKenna, what's up?" And I said, "Just putting a note in." And he said, "Already got you at 417, you good?" I said, "What did the note say?" He said, "Noise at South End, probable transformer resonance, caretaker monitoring." And I said, "Who called it in?" He said, "You." And then he said, "You sound weird, you all right?" I said I was fine and hung up because I didn't want to pass whatever was on me through the line to someone who couldn't see it. The rain slowed to a fine mist around 5. The sky behind the fog brightened in a way that isn't exactly light, more a lessening of darkness. I went back to the mausoleum because it was either go there or sit in the watch house and watch the clock until Nora came in at 6:30, and I would rather stand in the cold than listen to the second-hand step on my nerves. The 4th step held its oval pool, overflowing in a slick. I put the brass key on the stone. I didn't push it. I just set it there like you leave something for someone you don't want to shake hands with. The hum was there. The stone felt the way a tooth feels when you worry it with your tongue. I said one thing out loud to the air and the wet and my own shaking breath. I said, "I'm not opening anything. There's nothing heroic about the next part." I swept water toward the drain with the shovel, because the path will turn to a sheet of slippery mud if you don't, and you'll see your own feet go out from under you like a joke on a commercial. I kept my radio on my shoulder and clicked it every time the words started to form in the static, because hearing my own voice break, it felt like I could make something choose not to speak. I stepped on the fourth step and off it, back and forth, and felt a tremble in the stone like a train on far tracks. I picked up the brass key and put it back in my pocket because I didn't want to leave it anywhere in that place. I thought of the Hartley infant and the parents who would come in the morning and sit under the canvas and not look at anyone. I thought of Margaret's name doubling itself. I thought of the chain crossed right over left and left over right. I thought of my name in the book at a time I had not been there. I did not think about 2007 in Salem or teenagers in a dare or any story that does not belong to this ground. I stayed on this ground. At 5:45, the sky went from black to iron. The fog thinned. The lamp by the south end clicked off and on twice. The hum under the steps softened to something I could almost call memory. I did one more pass of the outer gate road and found the chain crossed left over right the way I had left it. The lock shut with the notch facing down as I prefer it. When I turned to go back up the road, Nora's car headlights slid along the inside of the fence and made the grass shine like it had been painted. She parked crooked like always and waved like she had been there every morning of every year, and none of this place's moods could touch that habit. Inside the office, she took off her glasses and wiped them. She said, "You look like you slept in a ditch." And I said, "I was out in the rain." And she said, "Same difference," and smiled without looking at me. She picked up the Section H ledger and squinted. "Where is the loose page?" she said. And I said, "I put it back." And she said, "No, the one I told you about on the phone." And I said, "You called?" And she shook her head. "No, I tried to, but I fell asleep," she said, which should be good news. She turned the ledger and I saw that the note I wrote about the radio at 3 was in my hand. But the name signed underneath the page was not mine. It was my name, but not the way I sign it. The loop on the J was wrong. The cross on the T was too low. It was like I had signed with my other hand. I made coffee because I needed to do something. The ring of keys on the counter made a sound like a dropped coin when I put them down. Nora picked up the brass one and turned it. "Where does this go?" she said, more to herself than to me. She held it up to the light. On the bow, where I had seen 17 etched in, the number was there but not sharp. It was almost gone. Not like it had been worn away by time, but like it had been erased with a single stroke of a finger with just the right oil on it. I told myself it had always been that faint. I told myself I was worked up. I told myself I needed sleep. At 6:58, I walked her out to the chapel to show her the bell rope and to prove to myself that rooms looked different in daylight. The rope hung still. The air in there felt ordinary, like warm wood and dust. The hatch to the cellar was shut. I put my hand on the pew to steady myself because I had given more attention to the night than to my feet. When I looked down, the clean line my palm had left on the tent rope earlier was on the pew's edge, faint and gray. I rubbed it. It didn't move. Nora said, "You okay?" And I said, "Yeah." The word came out flat. We went to the mausoleum steps because I wanted to stand on the fourth one and feel nothing. Daylight drains these places of their angles. You can pretend most of it into the past. The fourth step held no water. It had dried already in a way that didn't quite make sense. The others were damp. That one looked like a stone you had brought in from the sun and set in place. Nora said, "We should call the city to repaint the lamp. It's going to buzz like crazy if it warms up." She doesn't hear what I hear on those mornings. She hears the things she can fix. I don't know what to offer as a neat end. I went home and slept and woke and came back. The next night, the radio said nothing. The chain stayed crossed the way I left it. Margaret's name looked like whatever the name of the color is when water sits on gray. The Hartley infant went into the ground under a tent that didn't need rope ties because the wind died. When I checked the logbook later at the end of my shift, my own signature was already there, time-stamped 6 hours before I arrived. And under the line in a hand so close to mine that if I didn't know better, I would have said I wrote it. Someone had added a single sentence, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. What do you think of this story? Tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were there. I read every single one of your thoughts, and some of them stay with me longer than I'd like. Now, let's move on to the next story. because what's coming next might be even darker. The first sound was the metal ping of rain on the watchhouse roof, then the drip inside the doorway where the weather stripping never sealed right. I was holding the mag light in my teeth so I could button my jacket with both hands, and the beam shook against the window like it had nerves of its own. Out in the yard, the sodium lamps were the color of weak tea and fog. I could taste the wet air before I stepped onto the slab. I'm the night caretaker at Whisper Hill Cemetery outside town, and this was Halloween week when we get prank calls, plastic skeletons wired to fences, and this time, a YouTube guy with a livestream permit who swore he would not be a problem. The last week always drags when you tell yourself you might quit if it goes bad again. I had told myself that. I kept the Motorola radio on my shoulder because Carla at dispatch hates repeating herself, and she taps a pen against her headset mic when she thinks you're not listening. Frank, our grounds foreman, had already locked the east gate before the drizzle started. He does that slow wipe of his glasses whenever he thinks, like he's scraping a word off the lens. He was heading home. The YouTube guy, name of Evan Reed, set up near the older part by the mausoleum where the lamps buzz and the concrete steps slick over with the first mist. He kept his lighter in his palm like a coin and clicked it without thinking, even though he never lit anything. Cold made the radio crackle more than voices. I signed the watch log, slid the ledger back under the counter, and picked up the brass key we keep on a hook by the door. It doesn't belong to anything we use day to day. Old-fashioned, heavy, with a rounded bow and the number 12 stamped into it. It came with a retired caretaker named Orrin, who swore it was important and then died without saying what for. Frank says we keep it because people feel better if there's an answer on a hook. Evan waved from the lane that widens past the chapel. He had 2 cameras on carbon tripods. One pointed at the mausoleum steps and one down the row of family plots with angel statues black from decades of drizzle. He spoke to his phone like it was a friend. "We're live in 5, he said, then to me. "We're totally within the permit window." I trimmed the mics for wind. The cold had that metallic taste like you bit your lip earlier and forgot about it. I told him fine, stay off the raised markers and no touching the bell rope inside the mausoleum entry. He nodded and clicked his lighter like a tick. The first odd thing was paperwork, and it always is. Carla had sent me the burial sheet to compare to the map, because we were missing a color flag near Section B. In the drizzle, I leaned over the laminated map nailed inside the bulletin board case and ran my finger to the name May Bennett. Interment scheduled for the next afternoon. Date on the sheet said the 31st. The calendar on the board said the 31st. The sticker on the flag bin said stocked October 31st. But on the typed line for May, someone had entered October 29th. I scratched it out and wrote 31st in pen. It felt like correcting a misprint in the air. I walked the outer road past the caretaker shed. The Verrill gate on the west side was chained, padlock facing in. Frank always hangs it facing out for easy reach. I didn't touch it then. I told myself he must have been in a hurry in the drizzle and flipped it without looking. By the shed door, the ground felt soft under the toes of my boots. I held the light down and saw dark soil shining with wet, as if someone had dug and tamped it back even though it had only started raining 30 minutes before, and there had been no digging scheduled. I told myself it was just where we had run the steel trimmer too close last week and beat up the earth. At the chapel, the votive lantern we keep on low for people who visit at night when they say they cannot sleep, would not hold a flame. It's electric now because of fire code, but it still has a switch like a wick. I turned it. It glowed for half a second, reddened and died. I turned it again and the same thing happened. The air around the lantern felt colder than the rest of the room, as if the metal kept its own weather. I opened the panel and the bulb was fine, no water inside. When I shut it again, I realized it had gone very quiet. The watchhouse drip seemed distant. Somewhere out near the mausoleum, the sodium, lamps hummed and then the hum slid down in pitch like someone laying a hand on it, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. Told myself it was the transformer in the lamp head and nothing more. I radioed Carla to say I was doing a sweep of the old section. She clicked once to say she heard. The fog thickened when I crossed the lanes to the mausoleum. Evan had mounted a shotgun mic on the camera and he turned a dial I could not see and said, "Chat says it's peaking. You hearing that?" He was wired through his phone to the world and also to me, and he looked between us like I was another pane on a screen. I told him to keep the center aisle open. The bell rope inside the outer entry swayed a fraction on its own like a slow heartbeat, and then held still. There is a steel plate over the floor there that hides the utility access. I rested the mag light beam on it. It looked like any plate, damp with the air, a shine like a closed eye. The humming, if it was humming, was lower than the streetlights and higher than the refrigerated cases we used to have in the old shed. By the second hour, the drizzle had turned the gravel into a fine paste that stuck to my boots. Frank texted me a picture of a snapped branch he'd missed and said sorry about the mess near the Ortiz family plot. I told him I had it tomorrow. I used the Fisker's shovel to turn the branch aside and noticed the name Bennett again, on a granite pillow back from the lane. We only had one Bennett scheduled, May, a new grave. But this marker said Charles Bennett, 1972 to 2009. No relation, probably common name, but it repeated itself like a note tapping a jar. At the shed, the ring of keys we keep for the utility closets had one I didn't recognize. It wasn't brass like Oren's 12 key. It was nickel, light, with teeth too short to be useful. Its tag read Chapel South Cabinet, though the chapel has only one cabinet on the north side. I tried it on every lock in the shed and the closets by the watch house. It fit none. Back at the watch house, the radio on shelf 2, the one we never use because the push-to-talk button sticks, coughed alive by itself and whispered a word under the static. I couldn't make it out. I turned it off. It turned itself on again and coughed the same shape of sound. I unplugged it from the wall. Evan's voice then came over my active radio in the same second, too loud. We are live and we just heard a name. His lighter clicked. In the fog, his breath looked like steam from a cracked pipe. I made myself slow down. I wrote in the log that the east gate was secured at 2110, and the west Viril gate chain was inward facing to be corrected. I initialed and underlined it so I would not forget. I made a note about the lantern, the soil, the misprinted date. I walked to the mausoleum with the brass key in my fist because sometimes you hold a thing that feels like a rule. The plate at the steps gave back a coolness like touching turned-off machinery. Evan was narrating softly to the camera, a different voice than he used with me. You are seeing this live, he said. The mic is picking up a tone I can't identify, like an HVAC compressor in a basement. He lifted his hand from the lighter like he'd noticed it, and put both hands in his jacket pockets to stop himself clicking. His chat rolled by on the screen in his hand like a river of gnats, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. Could be water, I said. Drain line. He nodded too quickly and the camera shook in the fog. The bell rope twitched again, just the weight of the knot settling because damp rope moves when it takes on water. That is what I told myself. The air in the entry smelled like old stone and pennies. I shone the mag light down the corridor past the sealed compartments where nameplates dulled down to gray. The beam scattered on moisture like dust. A little after 10, Carla called to say someone had phoned in about kids hopping the back fence. I told her I was already there. It is what you say, so she will stop tapping the pen against her mic. By the fence, the soil was smooth, the grass wet to the knees. No shoe marks in the lane. No bikes leaned on the outside. The drizzle softened sound until all I could hear was the lamps and my own breathing like cloth. When I walked back past the chapel, the south cabinet that does not exist had a scuff across the paint as if something had rubbed it high, taller than my shoulder. My mag light beam shook a little. I steadied it against the door frame. My hand was cold enough that the light's knurled grip felt like a rasp. On my next round, the Viril gate chain was hung with the padlock out the right way, just the way Frank does it. I had not done it. No one had come through. The gravel would have told me. I swung the chain and it quoted the cold in the links and hit the post with a small, dull note. It was nothing. Distance does tricks when the lamps refract in wet. I walked back toward the older stones. Evan stayed near the steps. He said, "We have the mausoleum mic and the lane mic, and the chat is hearing a word." He glanced at me. They're saying it sounds like a name. If this gets out of hand, we'll wrap, I promise. The lighter clicked once and he shoved it deeper into his pocket like he was ashamed of it. Near midnight, which we never say out loud, the log page turned damp under my hand and the pen skated across the fibers. I pressed harder. The radio on shelf 2 said my name. It said it clearly, not whispered, not stretched. It said it like an order. I turned toward the shelf on instinct, and the active radio on my shoulder crackled at the same time. Evan's feed, 5 seconds delayed. bled the same sound into the fog outside. I heard my name from the shelf. I heard my name from the mausoleum mic through his open phone. My skin tightened under the jacket like the cold had found a seam. I keyed up to Carla. "You call me?" I asked. Her pen tapping stopped. "Negative," she said. "Line's quiet, you okay?" I told her I was fine. I asked if she had me as checked in for the hour. "You checked in at 2300, she said. "I've got your voice and timestamp. Want me to call Frank for a second pair of eyes?" I said no. The watch house window fogged where my breath hit it. I wiped the fog away with the back of my hand and left a clear oval that immediately slicked over. I walked to the mausoleum with the brass key in my pocket like a coin I could bite. The drizzle had polished the steps. Evan had shifted one tripod 6 inches left and apologized to me for touching the lane. The bell rope swayed a fraction, just the knots weighed again and again. "Wind," he said. "There's no wind," I said. We listened. There was the lamp hum and the drip from the outer lintel, and under that a tone like a machine in another room, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. Evan's chat scrolled. I saw my own name flash there and vanish. He flicked his lighter without striking. He tucked his chin in his jacket collar. I set the mag light on the top step, beamed down, and bent to the steel plate and put my fingers on the recessed ring. It was cold. The plate had 4 screws we never use because it is not meant to be opened by us. I put the maglite beam along the seam and the water beaded there like a line. The brass key in my pocket made a small sound against my coins when I shifted. It was not meant to fit anything here. I tried it anyway. Instinct moves ahead of rules sometimes. It did not fit the screws, obviously. But when I pressed the bow against the plate, I felt a shape that mirrored it through the steel. Not a magnet. Something like when you set a proper tool against a bolt even if you can't see it. I pressed until the cold made my fingers ache and pulled away. No mark on the metal. Evan adjusted the mic gain a hair. "It's under," he said. "Whatever it is, it's under." I told him to step back. I made myself breathe evenly. The cold air burned a little like the first sip of something with mint in winter. I did not open anything. I did not have the authority or the tools. I took the shovel from the lane edge, where we keep it, and knocked mud from the blade against the curb. I slid the tip under the edge of the plate and raised it a fraction to make sure it had not been cemented down by neglect. It gave with a scratch like 2 knives touching, the humming lilting up a half step and held there. Evan looked at me and then at his chat, as if asking permission from 1,000 people to keep filming. "This is live," he said quietly to me and also to that screen. "You're hearing this as we do." I wanted him to be a problem then so I could send him away. Rain ran off the brim of my watch cap and hit the steps with the patient rhythm of breath. I put the shovel aside. The maglite shook a little in my hand. I steadied it at my knee and the beam quivered on the plate. The rope twitched. The humming held. I took the brass key out and turned it in my palm. Number 12. Oren's key. He used to say that if you kept faith with little rules, big rules would keep faith with you. He would have told me to inventory the misprints and leave the plate alone. He would have told me to log the rope movement as air. He would have told me to go home. The radio on my shoulder popped in that hollow way it does when someone keys up and says nothing. Then it spoke my name again with that same tone of instruction. Evan's phone gave the same echo 5 seconds later. "That was not me," Carla said immediately, fast enough to fit in the delay. No pen tapping, just breath. "Say again you're 20. I told her I was at the mausoleum steps. I did not tell her I had lifted the plate a fraction. I put the key in my jacket pocket and felt the bow press the muscle of my thumb like a stamp. What I did next, I did, because the practical things are the only things you get to take credit for later. I walked the perimeter of the mausoleum with the maglite. I checked the lock bars. I put my ear against the masonry where it was dry under the drip edge. The hum came through the stone like a truck on a far road you could not see. The lane camera caught me in the corner of its frame. I saw my own back on the phone screen when I came around. Evan did not point it at me. He pointed it at the steps and I was just noise in the corner. The rope swayed again. The knot thumped the wooden panel lightly and stopped. The tone under the plate lowered until I could feel it in my knee and not just my ear. That was the way it built, not with jump scares, not with anything throwing itself at us, but with one small correction after another. One sensible explanation that kept being true, until, one by one, they failed. The misprinted date. The locked chain flipped and then righted. The soft soil under clear skies before the drizzle. The lantern taking light and letting it go. The repeating Bennett name. The extra key tagged for a cabinet that did not exist. The radio waking and coughing my name from two different directions with the same order-polite flatness. The bell rope that needed no breeze to change its mind. The plate that was just steel until it was an answer waiting for a question I did not want to ask. Around one, the fog thickened into something with edges. The lamps threw cones and those cones held. It was not darker exactly. It was a kind of fixed. I moved my hand through it and the wet clung and left a trail like a finger through flour. Evan lifted his camera to follow the motion and caught his own breath in the mic. "We are not alone," he said, because that is what he says when he does not know what else to say. In the shot, the steps were only steps. The plate was only steel. The rope was rope. Sound is where the lie lives. The hum was a line under everything we said and did. It made ordinary words tilt. I took the Fiskars and drove the point into the ground at the edge of the steps where the drain should run. If a drain was clogged, it could resonate. I dug enough to make a small trench to the lawn, and water filled it slowly, more than the drizzle should have made. It smelled like pennies and cold stone. Evan leaned closer with the mic. "There's water," he narrated softly. "There's definitely water." The rope stirred. The plate gave that knife scrape again as if the earth under it had settled. I set the shovel down and reached for the plate without thinking. I lifted it 2 fingers worth. I think if Evan had said stop, I might have. He did not. He said my name again, not like an order, but like someone calling you in for dinner when you were a child and had stayed out longer than you should in the yard. The tone under the plate swelled not in volume but in attention. I understood, then, that the brass key in my pocket was not for any lock I could see. It was for me. It was the thing I had to hold when I decided where the rules ended. I let the plate fall back that small space. The ring thudded. The hum did not stutter. It was as if it had been waiting for my decision and now filed it. I put the key back on the hook at the watch house and signed the log to say the mausoleum entry remained secure. My initials looked wrong. They looked like someone else copying my hand. In the shed, I unplugged the dead radio on shelf 2 again, even though it had no power left to take. It said my name one more time as I lifted the cord. In the chapel, the south wall cabinet that does not exist remained a plain plaster rectangle. I touched the paint. It was dry where the rest was damp. My finger came away clean. The night did not end in any story way. Evan kept streaming. He whispered to people far away. The chat wrote and scrolled. I made rounds and noted the small things because that is the job. The lantern took the switch and then did not. The chain hung the right way. The Bennett name sat heavy in the granite with water in the carved letters. A humming that nobody would have installed in a place like this wound through the stone-like wire. I did not open anything. I do not think I could have if I tried. The sky paled without admitting it and then did. The drizzle thinned to a moisture the air wore like another layer of clothes. The sodium lamps looked embarrassed by daylight. Birds started in the live oaks at the far fence where the thorn vines tangle and keep kids from cutting through. Evan's face softened back to a normal color on his phone. He told his stream he would be posting a cut later, and he thanked his subscribers and adjusted the tripod with hands that shook once and then steadied. He clicked the lighter and then hit it again like a habit he regretted. He said, "Whatever was under there is done with us," and I almost believed him. I made the last line in the log and closed the book and slid it under the counter. I hung the brass key back on its hook. The watch house smelled like wet paper and wool, not a bad smell at all. I told myself I had done the sensible thing at each step. I walked to the mausoleum and put my hand on the wooden panel where the rope hangs without pulling it. The plate looked no different. The air felt no different. I took a breath and it came in clean. I stood long enough to trust that. Back at the watch house, I washed the mud off the Fiskars and leaned it where it goes. Carla said good morning through a yawn. Frank texted that he was on his way to fix the branch near the Ortiz plot, and he added a smiley he uses so I know it is him. I smiled back even though no one could see it. I pulled the ledger out to mark Frank as on site and opened to a page that was already signed on the line I meant to take. My name in my handwriting was there with a time 6 hours earlier than I had arrived. The ink looked dry. The dot of my I was where I put it on tired nights. The loop of my Y had the kink that happens when my hand aches. You tell yourself there is a second book or a bad carbon copy. You tell yourself you left it that way and forgot. You tell yourself anything you need to keep walking. I checked the chapel once more before I handed the keys off. The south wall paint I had touched was still dry. I put my ear to it because that is something you end up doing even when it's stupid. It held nothing. In the quiet of that room there was only the small tick from the cooling baseboard and the remote hum of the lamps outside. The hum had its old pitch again. Boring, safe, like a machine you can rely on. I stepped outside into the light onto the wet slab, past the drip where the seal never catches, and everything was ordinary enough that it hurt a little. Frank walked up the lane with the steel on his shoulder and his glasses fogged. He wiped them with 2 fingers and left a clean stripe and said, "Long night?" In the tone people use when they want you to say it was fine so they can get on with the day. I told him it was manageable. The brass key hung on the hook and caught a strip of daylight across the number 12 like a coin spun and left to fall. Evan packed his gear and said thanks and did not look at the steps when he walked past them, which meant he was looking too hard on the inside. I sat once more at the watch house desk because I had the thought that if I reopened the ledger it would be blank where my name had been. The page was still there, the timestamp still wrong, my signature still mine. The only new thing was the sound I could suddenly hear through the floor. The same tone that I now knew I had been hearing all morning, only softer, patient, not demanding. It came not from the lamps and not from the radios, but through the concrete itself, under the foundation and past the slab. I held still until I could make myself stand. I told myself I was done with nights after this week, and I meant it, and I locked the door and I listened once. A mistake, because it came back into range just enough to write itself in me again like a note on a page. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. What do you think of this story? Tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were there. I read every single one of your thoughts, and some of them stay with me longer than I'd like. Now, let's move on to the next story, because what's coming next might be even darker. The first thing I heard that night was the knock of rain on sheet metal and the slow creak of the chapel door settling back into its frame. The second sound was my own breath, louder than I wanted it to be because the air in there always felt colder than the weather outside, like the stone held on to winter. I set the mag light on the ledge, clicked it twice to kill a flicker that had started, and listened for the scrape I thought I heard beyond the altar rail. I am the night caretaker at Greenfield Memorial, and this happened during my last week on the job. They moved me to nights after our usual guy, Walt, slipped on the north steps and decided he was done. I told the office I could handle the quiet. The cemetery is small if you compare it to the ones by the city, but out here the land breathes differently. The sodium lamps above the gate throw a permanent orange haze on the wet road and turn the fog into a wall that moves when you look away. There are straight rows of flats, some old upright tablets, and an 8-vault mausoleum built in the 70s. The watch house is a square room with a radiator that ticks like a metronome, and a desk with a ledger nobody uses unless there's a complaint. My routine was simple. Walk the perimeter at the top of the hour, check the chapel doors and the mausoleum lock. Log radio checks at 1:30 with dispatch because they like to know I haven't had a heart attack in the dark. I worked with a grounds tech named Lena, who did early morning cleanup and always wiped fog off her glasses with the exact corner of her sleeve, and a day caretaker named Alden who liked to lean in the watch house doorway on his way out and tap his old Zippo against his knuckles even though he quit smoking years ago. It was cold drizzle and wet air from the start. I remember because I took the Fiskars shovel from the rack just to move a divot of soft soil that someone's foot had pushed up by the row of angels, and my gloves were slick before I got to the first lamp. The first disturbance wasn't dramatic. A grave marked for a Wednesday burial had Thursday's date slipped into the holder, and I know for a fact we cut that grass on Tuesday and I signed the delivery for the flowers Wednesday afternoon. The plastic date tags come from a drawer in the watch house. They don't change themselves. I fixed it, logged the note, and told myself Alden swapped it on autopilot and forgot. On my next pass, I noticed the east gate had been chained again from the inside. We keep it latched at night but not locked, because the funeral home guy likes to cut through after midnight when he's got a transport. I was the only one with the chain up there and I hadn't touched it. The chain was wet, so it hadn't been there long. I unhooked it and put it back on its nail by the post. I started paying more attention to sound than to what the beam of the mag light hit. Dripping from eaves, the thin hiss of the fog. The radio cradled on my chest occasionally, catching dispatch traffic from another town and turning it into static that sounded like whispering until the syllables gave up. The chapel lantern by the back pew was my next issue. Alden is sentimental about old things and insists we light it on cold, wet nights like the dead need a house light. He showed me where to top it off and how to trim the wick so it burned steady. That night it wouldn't stay lit. It would throw a good orange for 20 seconds, then gutter down as if a breath crossed it, then die. I cleaned the glass. I checked for drafts. I relit it 3 times and stood still long enough to hear the tiny tick of cooling metal when the flame went out again. I gave up and set an electric candle in its place and felt like I'd cheated. By the chapel logbook, I saw a repeating name on 2 tombstone rubbings someone had left to dry. 2 different plots, 2 different sections, the same last name and exact first name, the same birth year, the same date of passing. I have seen cousins named after uncles. I have not seen this exact match with stones purchased years apart. I set the rubbings back and told myself the family liked tradition. I told myself to keep moving. Around 11, when the fog thickened and made the lamps look like dull coins, I walked up the mausoleum path to check the lock. The concrete steps hold the days damp like a sponge. Walking up them makes your boots suck at the edges, and your weight echoes in a way that always sounds like someone matches you. I leaned down to see if the weather had swelled the door, and my light caught the curve of something in the drain lip at the base of the lowest step. I dug it out with my glove finger. It was a small brass key with a rounded bow, dull with grime, no tag. I have keys for every door on a ring that pulls my belt down. This key didn't match any of them. I pocketed it and made a note to ask Alden in the morning. That was the first time it reached me through the concrete. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. It was small, like a transformer drone, but not electrical. It had a throat to it, if that makes sense, like a person humming through closed lips in the next room. I went still and told myself it was the wind knifing through the grate. It kept its pitch when the wind eased. On midnight rounds, the radio hiss turned into a pattern that made me set it on the bench outside the watch house and listen with my finger hovering over the transmit key. Static on a loop is nothing. Static that lifts and dips like speech will get you talking back to air. I waited and heard it pick out a word. Not the full shape, but the start of one. The same start, broken as if the radio was trying to teach itself how to say it. I asked dispatch for a radio check and they came back fine. The word kept trying. I turned the volume to 0 and felt dumb standing there with a heavy flashlight and a heavy ring of keys in a place full of names. There are benches at Greenfield that families donate. Bronze plates with "for mom" or "for dad." I came around the older section and saw Rain glistening on a bench with 2 plates. The same last name on each. The same first name rubbed into both as if someone had taken a finger to the metal and smeared the middle letter. The day caretaker would have cleaned that in the morning, I knew. But I also knew it is not how metal behaves. I wiped it with my sleeve and the smear came off like soot, leaving my jacket smelling metallic. Back at the watch house, I tried the brass key in every drawer lock and every side door to nowhere that the old place keeps. And it didn't fit anything. Not even the petty cash box that has a keyhole nobody uses. I set it on the ledger and it left a damp circle like it had been in water. The ledger is a hardback thing with yellow pages and pen marks from before I started. We only touch it when something needs to be noted. I turned a page to jot down the weirdness and saw a burial record dated that day with a grave time and hour in the future, signed by me in my handwriting. There was no burial scheduled. I stepped away and stood where the radiator could tick without me. When I stepped back, the line with my signature was gone. The page edges were damp. I went out again because sitting with a thing you can't defend from makes you feel weak. At the outer gate road, the chain was back around the post. No one had come through. The asphalt was wet but untracked. I unhooked the chain and felt how cold the metal had gotten in only a few minutes. The lamp above the gate buzzed and dimmed and lifted again in a tired cycle. like an old man who refuses to sleep. That was when I looked down and saw damp soil pressed up through the seams of the road like someone had pushed from beneath. You can tell the difference between a puddle and a mound of wet grit. This was grit in straight lines exactly where the expansion seams run between slabs. My first thought was that a groundhog had tunneled to the warm underside. And my second thought was that groundhogs do not measure their paths by our concrete. I got as far as the chapel before I noticed the bell rope moving. It's not used for service anymore. It hangs clean, a little frayed, and we tie it off so it doesn't slap against the frame when the wind hits east. It hung straight when I passed the first time. Now it had a small sway to it that did not match the lack of breeze inside. And every so often it would stop and tug like someone deciding whether to pull, then change its mind. The lantern by the pew refused to light even with the chimney removed. The electric candle threw a weak glow that made the shadows feel defiant. At 1, Lena called on the Motorola to tell me she was on her way in early because her kid had a fever and she needed to be done faster in the morning. I told her fine and listened to her hum the tune she always hums when she drives in the dark, a habit so consistent that dispatch teases her when they hear it on the air. Her hum flattened out by the time she got to the gate, turned into a long, even note, and then the radio cut. She came in 5 minutes later anyway, headlights diffused by fog. Glasses wiped with her sleeve corner and said her radio died for a minute by the fence where the old oak leans. She laughed at herself and said the cold killed it. We did an inside sweep of the mausoleum because I wanted another set of ears. The door took the key on my ring like it always does, heavy click, and the stale air breathed out with a smell like wet limestone. The first thing we both noticed was the quiet. No drip, no rattle, just the sound of our jackets when we moved. We walked slow between the vault faces. I called out names to keep my lungs working. Collins, Harper, Mayer. The center drain had a dark ring around it like water had stood there, and the concrete by the steps had a darker stripe that looked like a path. I asked Lena if she heard anything, and she shrugged and said sometimes the place sings and sometimes it doesn't. She touched her glasses with her sleeve and they squeaked. On the way back down, on the third step, the air changed. It went from cool to colder, and then it carried a frequency that made my teeth feel like they had wires in them, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. Lena froze and looked at me. I asked if she heard it. She said yes, very soft like a refrigerator but in the floor. She tapped the concrete with her toe and the hum didn't change with vibration. We exchanged the look that people exchange when they decide to lie to themselves for a job. It's probably the transformer at the gate, I said. It's probably the rain hitting the vent, she said. We locked up, and I watched the key scrape marks under the handle as if the lock had been used repeatedly through grit. When I turned away, the marks were gone. I don't scare easy, but I do get tired, and tired makes you think slow. At 2, the radio began doing the word again. It wasn't my name. It was a syllable from my last name, the first half of it, repeated, trying, a mechanical stutter. I answered it like a fool. Dispatch came on and asked me to repeat because they heard nothing. The watch house radiator ticked fast, then slow. The brass key on the ledger had a wet ring underneath like it had been set down fresh out of a sink. The ledger page I'd seen earlier kept itching the back of my head, so I opened it again and ran my hand over the paper because my palm felt damp anyway from the air. I found the page with the day's date and skimmed down. My name wasn't there. A burial note was. The family name was the one I'd seen doubled on the bench plates. The time was listed as 5 a.m. The location was the old section near the flat stone that reads Naomi, K 1942-2011. I know that stone because Alden brushes leaves off it in the fall like he knew her. The efficient line was blank. The signature line had 2 initials that looked like mine if I were in a hurry. Between 2 and 3, the disturbances stacked. The outer east gate chain was on the post every time I passed it, even though I had taken it down and looped it over the fence so it would be obvious. The chapel door, which always needs a hip to shut, swung and latched on its own, and when I opened it again, the bell rope was still. Then decided to make a single slow circle without a pull to start it. The flat stones in Section C were damp only along their carved names as if condensation learned to spell. I heard a low metal creak from the columbarium wall like a new plaque settling into old holes. I told myself everything that old moves. Around 3, rain stiffened. Not a downpour. A steady fine needlework that stitched the fog together and made the lamps into coins with halos. I took the Fisker's shovel because a corner of turf by the path had lifted, and I pressed it back and the soil yielded without resistance, like the ground had not compacted yet. That corner is 20 years old. I am not easily given to superstitions, but the ground should be what it is. I stepped away and looked at the mausoleum from the path. The sodium glow made its cement look jaundiced. The darker stripe at the base had widened. I could smell metal wetness that didn't come from my hands. I went in alone because I didn't want to pull Lena back into it. The door accepted my normal key. The smell inside had deepened. My maglite beam shook because my hand shook. And when it shook, the light made motion where there was none, and my head supplied the rest. I crouched and put my ear to the 7th step. There is a stupid intimacy in that action, putting your face to the cold stone that covers what you guard like you are listening through a pillow. I heard it very clearly, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I held my breath to hear if my breath made it louder. It stayed steady, a human-level tone, not quite a note, not quite a machine. I moved the beam along the step lips to see if there was a seam, a crack, a loose length. There was nothing to pry, nothing to lift. The center drain stain had dried to a darker color like the concrete had absorbed something. I crossed the vault faces with the light again and felt an urge to count to keep my mouth busy. 8, 8, 8. The radio on my chest clicked without me touching it, and the word came through. The same half of my last name, and then another half of another word that sounded like come. But only as a robot would learn it. I did not run. I am older than that, and I know running in a narrow place in the rain gives you a broken knee, and a story no one believes. I backed down the steps with my shoulders against the rail. When my boot hit the bottom landing, the humming deepened for a second. Like whatever was on the other side of that thickness knew I moved. The brass key in my pocket felt cold through the work pants. I took it out and held it without knowing why, and the air in the stairwell changed again. The pitch of the hum wobbled and found a new center. A note I felt in my throat instead of my teeth. I went outside like a man who tells himself he needs more air. The lamps made the rain into a curtain. My jacket was soaked at the cuffs. The watch house was a rectangle of orange warmth I could have gone to. I didn't. I walked the mausoleum perimeter because if there is a cause, you look for it. And if there is not, you do the motion anyway to make your body agree with your head. The concrete walls have those long seams where forms met. My light found the seam by the steps and lingered. The key felt heavier. The hum waited for me under my boots. On the 4th pass around, I stopped at the little steel service panel nobody uses. It's flush with the wall by the pipe, and it has a tiny keyhole that is more decorative than functional, because the maintenance guys long ago decided it was easier to pop the face off if they ever needed inside. In all my time there, no one has opened it. The shape of the keyhole matched the shape of the brass key more than it matched anything else I carry. I stood in the rain and argued with myself about myth-making and whether the mind forces shapes to fit. I wiped the key on my sleeve and put it in. It slid, not smooth but certain, like it hadn't turned in a long time. When it clicked, the hum under the steps stopped so abruptly that my ears filled with the sound of rain, as if that had always been the only sound in the world. I didn't open the panel. I don't know why. I stepped back as if the metal were a person whose shoulder I'd just tapped. The radio said the half of my name again and then said nothing at all. The bell rope in the chapel rang once across the compound. A single dull strike, not a pull long enough to spin. I locked the brass key into the old panel again and took it back out. The hum returned, not loud, but there, like it had missed its note and slipped back to find it. I went to the watch house and sat because my legs had started to feel hollow. The radiator ticked and the smell of wet jacket filled the room. I set the key on the ledger again and watched moisture rim it as if the brass sweated. I tried to write down what had happened and found my pen line dragging through water. I flipped to a blank page to get a dry surface. There wasn't a blank page. Every page ahead had writing, not detailed entries. A name repeated halfway down each page. The same family name from the bench plates and the ledger burial note, squashed into the lines as if a hand had pressed too hard. Farther in, the pages had my initials in the witness space. Some were too faint to read, like a carbon copy pressing up from beneath. The clock on the wall said 4:15. I told myself to ride the last hour out with small work. I checked the tool rack and tightened the cap on the fuel for the steel trimmer, because Alden always leaves it a quarter turned back to keep it from sticking. I pressed my thumb into the callus on my palm and breathed. The radio sat quiet. The lamps through the window stayed coins in fog. I took the shovel and did what any groundsperson does at that time of night when the head needs a job. I walked to the old section with the flat stone Naomi K. 1942-2011 and looked at the turf around it. There was nothing unusual. The date plate holder beside it had no plate. The ground felt firm under my boot. I shifted my weight and the hum found me under the soles again. The nearest thing to the steps was still the steps 30 yards off, and the sound coming through the ground made the damp hair along the back of my neck lift. I looked back at the mausoleum. The path between us looked longer than it ever looks in daylight. I told myself not to be a coward and went back up the steps. This is the part that lives with me. Not a vision or a figure, not a scream. A set of very practical things in a row that do not line up with how the world behaves. The door was chained from the outside. We do not chain that door. We have never chained that door. My ring has keys and a short length of chain for the gate if someone forgets to leave one by the post, and that chain was on my belt. The chain across the door had a padlock. The padlock had rust in the groove, but its shackle was wet like it had just been handled. I looked down at my ring of keys and then I looked at the brass key in my other hand because it seemed to have woken up in my palm when I didn't remember picking it up. I tried every key on the lock because habit writes the order in your fingers. None fit. The brass key was smaller than the shackle hole. When I touched it to the padlock, the hum under the steps rose by a hair and settled. I took the Fisker's shovel and tested the lock. Not to break it, just to see if the chain would give. It held firm. I felt the metal through the wood. The radio on my chest clicked. This time it formed my first name. Not perfectly, but enough to make my tongue push against my teeth like it might answer. I said into the rain that I heard it, and it stopped for a count of 3 and then tapped the mic on its own as if someone who had used radios knew that trick. I went to the service panel again. I fit the brass key into the slot and turned it, because doing anything felt better than being a deer in a beam. The hum cut off again. The chain over the mausoleum door slackened a fraction, not enough to fall, enough to lift and drop with a tick that the rain carried. I stood between those two facts and understood nothing. When I turned the brass key back, the hum returned with an almost human relief to its frequency, which is exactly the point at which the padlock clicked open with no hand on it and fell against the step with a hard steel sound that made me feel like my knees didn't belong to me. I didn't open the door right away. I have been in there at all hours. I have never been more aware of my own heartbeat than standing there with a shovel in one hand, a brass key in the other, and a door I am responsible for easing on hinges I know by feel. I eased it. The interior smell hit and then flattened. Not musty, not sweet, just mineral like something mined. The drain stain was gone. The concrete stripe along the floor where I had seen it darkened was gone. The place looked undisturbed, and that is when the fear went from a high burn to a low, steady flame. The quiet inside pressed. No drip, no tick. I took 3 steps in and kept my beam low. The hum came from everywhere and nowhere. The radio breathed without traffic. The names on the vault faces caught the light in dull arcs. I told myself to count 8 again and got to 6 when the beam fell across a small rectangle on the floor by the back wall. It was the chapel date plate for Thursday. I picked it up and it was dry, not dusty. Dry like it had dried by itself in a place where nothing dries. I set it on the marble sill and said the word no out loud without meaning to, and heard my voice land like it didn't travel. I turned to leave. The bell rope sounded again across the grounds, a single gentle clap. I took the steps easy, and on the 3rd step my boot slipped a half-inch and found water where there had been none. And I had the clear thought that if I fell and knocked out a tooth, I would have to explain that to a dentist who would mark the time. And that was somehow the thought that made what happened next feel familiar already, like I had already told it to someone. On the landing, the padlock lay open where it had fallen. The chain had looped itself back through the ring without a lock to hold it. The brass key in my hand felt warm in spite of the air. I put it in my pocket because keeping it out felt like an invitation. The hum dipped, and in that dip I heard Lena's hum, the one she does when she drives, echo through it for a second as if someone had held a shell to a microphone. I called her name on the radio and got nothing. Then I got a half-second of her voice finishing a sentence she had said hours earlier. Then I got the part of my last name again, and then dispatch asking if I was okay and why was I keying up without speaking. I shut and latched the door and clipped the chain because doing the practical things is survival. I picked up the padlock and held it with my glove until I could convince myself that it was only cold because steel is cold. I walked down the steps and felt the hum follow under my feet, not louder, just attending. I walked to the watch house through rain that had turned to a misty fall, more wet than visible. I put the padlock on the desk with the brass key beside it and watched water rim both like they had been outside all night. It was almost 5. Dawn is a word people use for hope when they have never been awake at that hour. The fog goes to a different color. The lamps shut off one by one and leave shadows behind them like you were counting on a handhold that someone took away. Lena knocked on the watch house door and stuck her head in and said the kid was okay and she'd be leaving early. She wiped her glasses with the corner of her sleeve and asked me if I needed coffee. Alden came in not long after, tapping his Zippo against his knuckles, hair wet under his cap, and said I looked like I had been pulled out of a sink. He asked if I had relit the chapel lantern. I told him it wouldn't take. He shrugged and said sometimes the damp wins and asked if I noticed a chain by the mausoleum door, because he didn't remember us ever chaining that. I told him I had put it away. At 6, the fog lightened, and the hum became a suggestion I could ignore if I worked hard at ignoring. I went out with the shovel to put a neat line on a rut by the path because leaving the grounds tidy sometimes feels like fighting back. The air had gone from metallic to cold wet. The lamps clicked for daylight and echolocated one last buzz. I told myself it was over. I told myself the night had turned on me because it was my last week and my brain wanted a story to remember. I told myself I would hand Alden the brass key and he would say something like, "Oh, that goes to the meter box," and we would bed the weirdness down in practical language. I brought the key inside to the ledger to write it down so that it would become an entry. And entries are just things that happened. I opened the ledger to the day's date. The page had dried. My note about the date tag I'd written early was there in my handwriting. The burial note at 5 a.m. was there with the family name, and underneath it a neat line that read "Witnessed by," followed by my first and last name in letters that looked like mine if I were careful. The time next to my name read 4:52 a.m. I looked at the wall clock. It said 6:07. I ran my finger under the line to see if ink lifted. It didn't. On the desk, the brass key left a rim of wet like it had just been pulled from the drain. I stood very still and heard it again under the new quiet, a sound that had traveled with the night and only went lower with daylight. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. What do you think of this story? Tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were there. I read every single one of your thoughts, and some of them stay with me longer than I'd like. Now, let's move on to the next story, because what's coming next might be even darker. The first sound was not the rain, not the traffic far off, not even the crows that sometimes settled on the angel statues and clicked their beaks like old locks. It was the tiny metallic clink of the watchhouse door bolt finding its seat behind me. I remember how the cold air in the chapel corridor hung on my lips when I breathed, how the rubber soles of my boots whispered over the wet tile as I stepped back into the night. The lamps out there burn sodium, the kind that turn skin sallow and make your breath look like smoke from an engine. I had just finished the last sweep of the perimeter road and was heading to the mausoleum steps because the drain had backed up again and water was pooling there. The kind of pooling that will creep back into the vaults if you ignore it. I'm the night caretaker at St. Roch No. 2, and this happened on a Wednesday, my 7th consecutive night on. The week I told myself would be my last before I asked to be moved to day shift. The rain was a thin, cold drizzle, just enough to sit on your eyelashes and beat on the radio mic. I checked the outer gate as I passed it. The chain I had left looped was now latched again, not by me, and the brass mouth of the lock carried a smear of fresh grit. It wasn't the first small thing that week. On Monday, Earl had showed me a plot record for the Broussard family that listed a death date a year from now. He had his lighter out like he always did, tapping the base of the Zippo against his thumb until the skin was pink. "Printer glitch," he said, though we both knew the printer does not invent numbers. On Tuesday, Vanessa, who comes in evenings to handle flowers and notes for the upcoming All Souls Vigil, said the oil lamp in the chapel kept snuffing itself out. No drafts in there, no bad wick. She took off her glasses and wiped them with the tail of her sweater like she always does, then laughed because the glass still fogged from the damp. Yesterday, the key on my ring stamped 12C fit nothing I could find. Not the watchhouse lockers, not the power closet, not the old columbarium doors. I kept it because my supervisor told me to never return a key until you know what it belongs to. You would be surprised how many dead things come back because someone's careful, or because someone's not. By the time I reached the mausoleum, the water had found the lowest point and was tracking along the seam of the lowest stair. My maglite beam caught the sheen and made the stone look like wet bone. I set the Fisker's flat shovel against the rail and bent to clear the drain grate with my gloved fingers. The smell there is always metallic, like a handful of coins handled too many times. When I pulled the grate, something small clinked down the pipe. Then a second later, something else, like a bead hitting a bottle. I lifted the radio from my shoulder. "Watch house, this is grounds," I said, because I heard my own voice and needed it to sound like a job and not a confession. Earl answered with his usual little cough. "Copy," he said, the word flattened by static. After, when I listened to the recording, that copy would have a second voice behind it. But in that moment, all I heard was the distance between us. I don't like to say it because it sounds invented, like something people add to stories to make them sticky, but I need to be exact for this to make any sense. As I leaned over the open drain, I felt the stone beneath my left palm hum. It was so soft I almost thought it was my blood in my hand from clenching the shovel handle. I took my palm away and laid it flat again. I could feel a thread of vibration rising through the step, so faint it might have been a motor 3 streets away. A substation yawning, anything but what it was. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I stood up too fast and the world tilted. I told myself I was drained because I'd been running a steel trimmer all afternoon along the west fence, and the vibration was still in my bones. I took 3 breaths in the cold, wet air and looked over the stones. The angels and obelisks and vault fronts feel like a crowd when there's fog. Faces become noise. Somewhere to my left, a bell rope in the old chapel swung once and clicked against the brass guide. We don't connect it to anything now. It's ceremonial, a battle rope for the dead. The swing might have been a draft from the open door. The chapel lamp went out again right after that. Vanessa had trimmed the wick like a pro, and I had replaced the chimney glass. The flame just died, the way a person goes quiet when they're about to say something they shouldn't and decide not to. I relit it and watched the smoke hold to the ceiling as if unsure where to go. When I went back to the steps, the grate I'd set on the stone had been slid 2 inches toward the drain. No one had walked past me. I looked at my watch and wrote the time in the pocket log I carry, because the main ledger in the watch house has a swollen spine, and sometimes the pages stick. The pen scratched in the wet and the paper wrinkled. As I wrote, the radio hissed and gave a ghost of a word. It sounded like the last syllable of someone saying open. I adjusted the squelch and asked Earl if he had just keyed his mic. No answer, then a cough, then copy. I checked the line on my glove and on the shovel. The drizzle felt colder, like it was not rain but the air itself condensing. The disturbances didn't come all in a row then. They were spread like small tacks through the next hour. A little girl's name repeated on 2 stones 20 yards apart, same birth date, same dash where the last date should go, Celia Baptiste. Only 1 stone had a row of fresh poppy stems laid on top. The head snapped off as if someone had walked by and clipped them with their fingernails. Damp footprints the size of my fist on the tiled floor of the watch house, looped from the door to the desk and back to the door. A tiny brass key left on the chapel pew with an oval tag, blank as a polished coin. Light enough to swing when I picked it up, heavy enough to feel like it belonged to something important. And then the drain at the mausoleum. When I went back to check that the water hadn't crept in again, my light caught the inside of the pipe and the lip looked scored, almost like someone had pushed something through from the vault side. Nothing large could fit there. It's a narrow slip meant for water and silt. At about 2 hours into my shift, I heard the hum again as I crossed the inner road. Not loud, not even clear, just a tremor in the ground when my right heel touched. I stopped, went back 2 steps, and stood with my light on my boots. The night had gone thin. The sky in a drizzle like this is low, almost local. You feel like you can push your hand into it. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I wasn't at the steps when I felt it that time, so the words felt wrong in my head, but it was the same quality. Like something in the stone had a throat. When you work nights like this, you learn the habits of the people around you. Earl taps his lighter when he's about to say something he doesn't want to write down. Vanessa will pretend her glasses are smudged when she's trying not to cry. She blames the weather, but it is never the weather. Miguel, the day foreman, hums a hymn under his breath when he's by himself. Sometimes off-key, sometimes as if he is only remembering the idea of the tune. I tell you this because it matters what we expect to hear and what we allow ourselves to call by its proper name. In the drawer of the watch house desk is a ledger that has been there since before any of us worked here. The first page is dated 1981 and the last entries are ours. We write who comes and goes, when we open and close, when a gate is found relocked or a tool is borrowed overnight. The last name entered for a burial that week was Henry J. Baptiste, interred Monday, plot niche 12C, vault row east 2. I knew the name because it sits near the Broussards, and because a little girl's stone in that row bears the same last name and an unfinished date. I took the ledger with me when I went to check the vaults, tucked it inside my jacket because the damp will warp it worse. At the mausoleum steps, my light picked on something new. The drain grate had been rotated a full quarter turn since I last replaced it, aligning with a groove I'd never seen. When I ran the tip of the Fiskars along that groove, the sound was high and tight like a wire under tension. I tried the blank oval tag key on the grate. Nothing. Obviously. But then the 12C key on my ring slid into a hairline seam beside the fourth step and clicked in with a softness that was unbelievably satisfying. It's the sound a safe makes when you find the right number in the tumbler's line. I heard Earl in my ear say something then, only it wasn't Earl's voice. It was my voice in that flattened radio tone saying, "Don't." I jerked my hand back from the key and it stayed there, sticking out like a tooth grown where it shouldn't be. There is a stupid human urge that asks one question when you find a door. What if it opens? I turned the key. The step shifted under me. Not up or down, but toward me. The slightest roll and a thin seam of even colder air opened against my shins like the breath from a throat. The humming came up hard enough then that the maglite shook in my hand because my hand shook. The sound was not loud. If someone had been standing 10 feet away, they might not have heard it. But it was inside my bones. It made my teeth feel too big in my mouth. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. "Watch house," I said into the radio. "Earl, I think there's a maintenance panel here. Did you know about a service access on the steps?" Static, the kind that has shape. Then a word, only one, repeated with mechanical patience. "Return." Not the voice of a person, not even a bad prank. A single, almost human syllable, and then a cough at the end like it had borrowed one of Earl's habits. I thought about Vanessa wiping her glasses, how you bring your hands to your face without meaning to when you're trying to make a thing not be happening. I closed the access. The step slid back into place like it had been politely waiting, and I pulled the key. The brass was colder than the air, which is wrong. Metal should hold your heat. The next hour was a loop. The bell rope stirred again once, not enough to swing, just a twitch as if something had decided against calling attention. The oil lamp went out even after I trimmed the wick a second time. I relit it with a match because sometimes a match is the way to make something obey. The ledger pages clung to my wet glove when I tried to mark the time, and when I peeled them off, my watch had stopped for 6 minutes, and then started again without my noticing. I checked the Baptiste entries. The last record for niche 12C had a small note in handwriting, not mine. Temporary access under steps for flood mitigation. Keep sealed. No date, no initials, just the sentence. As if someone had walked by, dipped the pen, and told me something I was already supposed to know. At around 3 in the morning, I heard the humming again in the steps, and this time there was a new quality in it. An edge like a sung note the body recognizes without putting a word to it. Rain ticked on the maglite as I held it low and the beam jittered with my breath. The drain gurgled. The tiles at the chapel threshold squeaked under my wet boots. I tuned the radio down until the hiss was almost nothing, and then it hissed louder anyway. "Return," it said again. And then a second voice layered under it, humming the first measures of a hymn I did not know I knew until my mouth was moving with it. The voice was not a voice, not a person, but it borrowed one the way radios do when they grab interference. Miguel's hymn without Miguel. I told myself the most practical thing I could. I would open the access again and see what was there, because the only thing worse than not knowing is pretending you don't want to. I took the shovel and pried gently at the seam until the 12C key slid home. The step rolled back an inch. Air came up, colder still, dry in a way the rest of the night wasn't, like it had been held away year over year. The smell was faint and metallic and old paper. I lay flat so I could angle the maglite in. The beam showed an undercut, a shallow cavity that followed the line of the steps, brick-lined and tight. You could slip a hand in, not much more. The drain pipe ran through it. In the far corner, where mortar had gone crumbly, I saw a shape pressed into the dust. Not an animal, not jewelry, not a toy. A key that matched the blank oval tag key in my pocket, only this one had been there long enough to hold the shape of its tag in the dust. My radio clicked twice without me touching it. The clicks were like someone tapping a lighter against their thumbnail. Copy. a voice said. My voice again, flattened, then Earl's cough, then the exact cough again like the night had recorded it. The humming rose. Not loud, inside my jaw. I reached in and my glove touched the dusty key. It was colder than the stone, and the oval tag was not blank. It carried an engraving shallow enough to have been done with a nail. Return when he returns. My name was on the other side. The handwriting was mine, and I had never written it. My hand came back empty without my telling it to. The rain outside the little mouth of the access made a steady hiss, and the sodium lamps hummed their own electric hum and turned the fog the color of stale bread. I closed the access very carefully and stood until my knees stopped feeling hollow. I took the ledger from my jacket, went into the watch house, and sat at the desk. My breathing loud in that small room sounded like someone else's. I turned through the pages to find the place for Wednesday, my pen leaving wet marks on the page edges, and saw that the line where I would have written 0240, checked mausoleum drain, access secure already contained those words in my handwriting. Down to the flourish I give the D in secured when I am in a hurry. The time written was 1:34. I had been with the steps or near them or thinking about them at a 1:34, but I had not written that line then. The pen I would have used was still in my jacket. I had the stupid urge to check the CCTV, even though ours is the sort that blinks recording to a hard drive we send for overwriting every month and I don't have access to. The bell rope twitched. A drop of rain hit the windowsill with a neat note like a pebble hitting a bottle. The last hour crawled. Senses get sharp for no reason and then blunt in the wrong places. The hum from the lamp seems to move like a person. The wet in your socks feels like something alive. The little cobweb in the watchhouse corner had gathered so much damp it hung like a string of beads. I sat with the radio turned to a murmur and listened until the word it wanted to say started to sound like my name. I went out to the mausoleum one last time, because leaving a thing unsaid doesn't make it disappear. The steps were just steps. The drain let water. My beam shook, but the beam was steady where it hit the stone. I put my palm on the step and felt nothing I could describe without sounding like I was trying to make you feel something. Then very softly, so close that the stone carried it like breath, the vibration rose and I felt it answer the bones in my hand, the way a tuning fork answers the note that made it. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. Dawn here is not clean. It arrives like a lighter that won't catch, then catches and burns too hot for a second. The lamps cut off with a relay clack. The fog turned from brown to white. The rain scaled back to a mist that made every flat surface look newly varnished. I exhaled a little because there is safety in lines. Daylight is a line. I locked the chapel and spun the chain through the outer gate the way I always do. When I got back to the watch house, Vanessa was early. She popped in and said she had brought café au lait from the place on St. Claude. She wiped her glasses with her sweater. Her eyes were red and she pretended it was the weather. She asked me how the night had been, and I told her something true that was smaller than the truth. Quiet, I said. Wet. She nodded as if that explained why the bell rope was angled slightly from center. When she left, I sat down to write the previous night into the ledger because whatever else had happened, the book does not care about feelings. And the jobs that don't care about feelings are the ones that keep the water from rising. On the page already bearing my not my writing from 0134 were the rest of my notes. In the same hand, the same quick letters, the same habit of underscoring times, the same error I make where I write the 4 in a way Earl teases me for. It ended with a final line I had not yet lived. 0525. Returned 12C key. Access secured. Return when he returns. The oval tag key sat on the desk where I had set it. Only the tag wasn't blank anymore. The engraving was a depression like the pressure of a ring that's been worn a long time. My name again. I turned the tag over and the other side was blank. My radio clicked twice and coughed. I could have told myself a dozen logical theories. An old maintenance line, some electrician's bad joke from 20 years ago, vibration from trucks on Rampart, a shared human sense that makes patterns where there are none. I could have gone home and slept and come back and the steps would have been steps and the fog would have gone and the lamps would have hummed and we would have stacked chairs for the vigil and Miguel would have hummed a hymn without knowing why it fit. I closed the ledger. I put the 12C key on the hook with the others. The metal was colder than the room. The hollow of my palm remembered the vibration like a tune I could not whistle. When I stepped out into the wet morning, I turned once, because the body insists on one last look, and I had the smallest stupid hope that some physical thing would show me I had been ordinary all night. And the mausoleum just sat there with its wet face catching the light, and the drain taking water and the steps holding the world up as if that were nothing, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. What do you think of this story? Tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were there. I read every single one of your thoughts, and some of them stay with me longer than I'd like. Anyway, let's move on to the next story, because what's coming next might be even darker. The first sound that cut through the wet air was metal touching stone, a tiny ring that didn't carry far in the drizzle but felt sharp in my ears. I was halfway down the main path, counting my steps between the sodium lamps because the fog swallowed the distance, when it rang again, softer, as if from inside the wall. You can tell a lot about the night by the way the cemetery holds sound. When it's cold and wet like this, noise sits on the ground and doesn't travel. I'm the night caretaker at Greenwood Avenue Cemetery, and this happened during my last week on the job. A Tuesday I only took because Dennis swapped shifts to see his kids' school play. I had the keys, the Motorola clip to my belt, the heavy mag light, and the same circuit I always walked after the gates were chained at 9. The whole place is a shallow hill with 2 paved loops. Lower section old and crowded, upper section newer with the mausoleum and the columbarium wall. The lamps make it look warmer than it is. The drizzle makes the beam of your flashlight look like it's filled with dust. The air had that metallic taste I never got used to, like I had a coin tucked under my tongue. I signed into the logbook in the watch house at 8:58 p.m., scrawled my initials next to patrol, and told myself 5 more nights and I was done. Marla, the manager, had been rubbing her glasses with the hem of her sweater when she handed me the ring of keys earlier. Same habit every time she was nervous. "The city's still talking about those Halloween tours," she said, voice flat. "We're not doing them. If anyone shows up, call me, don't try to be nice." She's not unfriendly, just practical. Dennis, who works days, tapped his lighter against his knuckle in the doorway. He only smokes after funerals, but the motion is automatic. "Watch the slope behind the chapel," he said. Water's pooling again, and the bell rope in the old section keeps twitching. Drafts. He grinned like he didn't believe in drafts. It started small. There was a grave 2 rows past the Iron Angel with a date plate swapped, month and day reversed. Neat and wrong in a way that looked deliberate. I checked the ledger card at the watch house desk earlier when the rain eased. The burial had been in April, not August. When I passed that stone again, the drizzle had deepened and the topsoil around it looked darker than the others, damp in a patch the size of a coat. We'd had rain all afternoon, sure, but the grass on either side was normal. Those are the kinds of details you tell yourself you're overthinking. There's always a reason. People mess up plates. Grounds settle unevenly. I kept to the route. The caretaker shed smelled like gasoline and wet rope. I peeked in to make sure the steel trimmer was on its hook and the Fisker's shovel was where Dennis liked it. Blade down, handle to the corner. I shut the door, tried the handle, and moved on. By the time I reached the lower loop gate, the planks of the small footbridge there were slick. I ran my boot along the bottom of the chain and felt a fresh grit, like someone had dragged it across the macadam. The gate itself was locked, my padlock, but the loop road gate on the opposite side had swung a half-inch against the chain and tapped the post, metal on metal. That was likely the sound I heard earlier. When I cut up the side path toward the chapel, my radio hissed with the usual open-channel noise. On nights when the signal bounced off the mausoleum's concrete just right, it would repeat a vowel like a stutter. Nothing mysterious, just interference. Tonight it said one soft word, chopped in static, paused, and said it again. "Here." Then the carrier squelched and went quiet. I thumbed the transmit button, told the empty channel I was on patrol and fine, then felt foolish and clipped it back on. The chapel is small, brick, with a slate roof and a brass lock that's older than me. I carry a key for it because sometimes families leave flowers inside and forget to close up. The path along its wall leads to 5 steps that drop into the little stone courtyard that serves the mausoleum. I stopped there. It was like the damp air had a new seam running through it, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I stood still, rain in my hair, breath making a small cloud in the beam of my light. You can fool yourself with plumbing sounds in an old building, the way water moves through rusty lines, the way a compressor hum reaches your bones. But the mausoleum doesn't have anything like that. There's power for the wall lights and the small fan that keeps the air from going stale. None of that is under the steps. I told myself it was traffic beyond the fence. The street is far enough that when the fog is thick, the noise slides over you like a low ceiling. I put my hand on the brass railing. It felt warm compared to the stone. At the bottom, the metal door to the mausoleum was propped the width of a paperback with a thin wedge. "We don't prop that door." I pulled the wedge and pocketed it. If I had turned around then, I could have signed the log, made a note, and gone back to the watchhouse. Instead, I clicked the beam into the dark and stepped inside. The air smelled of paper and melted candle wax, the kind left behind by visitors who should know better. The inner lights came on with a delay I recognized. The motion sensor is old and doesn't like the cold. The plaques along the wall caught the faint shine in their bevels. I'm not sensitive to this kind of thing, but the acoustics inside a place like that make you aware of your own heartbeat. There's nothing mystical about it. The space is a soft box for small sounds. You hear your shoes find grit. You hear cloth move, that's all. The routine disturbances kept stacking. In the office ledger, a page had been torn neatly along its perforation and set back exactly where it belonged, which defeats the purpose of tearing out a page. In the columbarium niche index, a name appeared twice with two slightly different birth years. Someone's transcription error, sure, but I couldn't stop noticing how the second entry had the newer pen ink. Bolder, like whoever wrote it pressed a little too hard. The bell rope in the old section, the one attached to the antique safety bell stand no one uses, had a damp spot on the knot as if someone with wet gloves had tried it. When I got back to the shed on my second circuit, the door I'd checked earlier was locked again, but the padlock was turned with the shackle facing away, not how I leave it. Small things like that are what you learn to pay attention to in this job. You learn the exact way a person pulls a door, the angle Dennis likes his tools, the habit Marla has of wiping her glasses until the lenses squeak. You learn the cemetery when it's asleep and when it fidgets. It was fidgeting. I found the brass key on my third pass. It lay on the stone lip beneath the chapel's side window, dull in the rain, cold as ice when I picked it up. It didn't match anything on my ring. No tag, no stamp. You can tell a lot about a key by the wear on its shoulders and the way the grooves are cut. This one had almost no wear, as if it had lived in a drawer for years. I tried it on the chapel door out of simple habit. It didn't fit. I tried it on the utility door by the mausoleum, the old furnace closet we keep empty. It held for a fraction of a second like it wanted to go, then stopped with a firm shoulder. That's when I noticed the wedge was back under the mausoleum door. Same place, same angle, as if I had never pocketed it. I reached down and found the wedge still in my coat pocket. My hand closed on two identical pieces of pine. "Here," my radio said again, softer, almost kind. I turned it off, and the quiet fell in a way that made the drizzle sound bigger. Dennis had mentioned the bell rope, so I went down to look. The old stand is a three-legged iron thing set between two headstones, with dates from the first decade of the last century. The rope is new, cotton, replaced after vandals cut the old one. The small cup and clapper are original. They don't connect to a buried coffin, obviously. We keep it as a historical bit for the tours when we still ran those. No one's going to be buried alive in 2025 with a rope in their hand in this town. Still, the stand had a lean to it, a degree off straight, like someone had pulled and let it go. That's where I heard it again, and I can't tell you if hearing it that second time made it more real or just made me more focused. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. It was warmer now, like standing over the cover of a dryer, the sensation of a machine running somewhere you're not allowed to see. I went back up, slow, counting my breaths the way you learn to do in cold air. Left hand on the rail, light down at my boots to watch for the slippery spot where the algae takes the stone. At the bottom, I crouched and ran the beam along the joint where each riser met the side wall. There were tiny holes drilled into the mortar in a straight line, 4 of them, capped with a gray putty that was slightly lighter than the surrounding stone. That's new. I would have noticed. I reached down and the putty felt soft. I should explain something. We have a binder in the watch house, old clippings and notes, including one photocopied article called The Bell Ringer, Pennsylvania, 1951. Some volunteer replaced safety bells at a hill cemetery, and on Halloween night, one bell rang for 10 minutes straight, a grave belonging to a boy buried in 1903. It's a story people tell to make other people uneasy in places like this, harmless. There's no reason for our cemetery to share anything with that one. Still, the word bell in my head, The wedge that returned to the door. The key that didn't fit any door I knew. This is how a normal night starts to tangle. Marla walked the upper loop with me once around 11 to check the storm drains. She cupped her hand over her glasses because they fog instantly in this weather, and she peered at the catch basin over the main culvert. This was cleared Monday, she said, more to herself. Water rushed under the grate fast enough to make a low drone. She shivered and stepped back. You hear that? You can feel it in your jaw. I did. It was like standing over a throat clearing. You okay? She asked. Fine, I said. There's a key near the chapel. Doesn't match our set. She pressed her lips together, rubbed the glasses again. We've had break-ins before, tag it. We'll figure it out tomorrow. After she left, everything got smaller and sharper. I noticed the exact way rain edged the plastic flowers in a vase and left the stone around them dry in a perfect ring. I noticed a little rectangle dry against the inside of the mausoleum door, where the wedge must have sat for years, and never left a mark until now. I noticed names repeating where they shouldn't. 2 Coras with the same last name on opposite ends of the wall, different middle initials, exactly 10 years apart to the day. I checked the burial cards. 2 different families. The odds of that are what they are. You can live in coincidences all night if you let yourself. Near midnight, I took the Fiskar's shovel off its hook just to feel the weight of something simple. The handle is smooth where Dennis's hand rides it. I put it back, wiped the water off the blade out of habit, and clicked the light off in the shed. The sudden quiet made my ears ring. The climax of it didn't feel like any crescendo. It felt like being led by small rational steps toward a door I didn't know I could open. The brass key burned cold in my pocket. The wedge I'd pocketed twice was in my other. I went back to the mausoleum steps and waited until my breath slowed and the radio, off, no longer tried to fill the silence. I knelt. I dug the edge of the wedge into the soft putty over the first drilled hole and pried. It came away easy, and underneath was the head of a screw. New, clean, stainless. I put the wedge between my teeth, tasted sap and damp, and turned the screw with the corner of the brass key. It's not meant for that, but the brass bit and held. I turned it until I felt relief in the threads. The humming got stronger, not louder, more present. The second plug came out just as easily. With the third, the key slipped and nicked my knuckle against the stone. No blood in this air, not with the cold, just a sting. The fourth screw turned and the whole riser creaked along a seam I didn't know existed. I set the mag light on its end so the beam popped up right into the fog like a dull lighthouse. I put both hands on the riser and pulled. It lifted a 1/4 inch. Water beaded along the seam and made a zipper sound. Beneath was a darkness that wasn't just absence of light, but a place that had not had air in it for a while. The humming was right there, as if a throat had been lifted to my ear. My own breath went shallow. I told myself we were dealing with old ventilation, some forgotten ductwork, maybe a small fan for humidity. There are always explanations you can hold like a handrail. I eased the riser back. Inside the cavity was a small metal box mounted to the underside of the step. Matte gray. Wires running from it along the underside and into the wall. The wires were new. The box had a keyhole on its face, a perfect little circle waiting. It looked nothing like our locks. I touched the box and felt a vibration. The hum more a texture than a sound, and I realized my teeth were set because my jaw hurt. My finger came away with a smear of black. The brass key fit that circle like it had been cut yesterday. I didn't turn it. I put my hand flat against the stone to steady myself, and the cold of it went through the heel of my palm into my wrist in a way that made me think of an X-ray. The wedge was under my knee. The mag light hummed with its own tiny coil somewhere in its head. Everything held still. Rain dripped into the beam and burned for an instant like a fuse, then went out. I thought of that 1951 volunteer, his bell ringing for 10 minutes, the way everyone must have stood and counted without admitting they were counting. I slid the key in deeper until it seated and ticked. My radio came to life with a burst of grain and said the same single word again, perfectly clear this time, in a voice I swear I know from somewhere I cannot place. Here, the box clicked. The hum stopped so abruptly that the silence felt like my head had been lifted off my shoulders. No mechanical spin down, no fade. Off. Then there was a sound from inside the wall that made every part of me go absolutely still. The soft, scratching shuffle of something adjusting to a new position. Not an animal. Not a person. Not anything I can describe beyond the practical fact. It sounded like a stack of thin metal plates settling into alignment after being held just out of place. I turned the key back, hoping to undo whatever I'd done. It wouldn't move. The brass had warmed in my fingers. I put the riser back and the screws started to pull themselves toward their holes as if the threads had a memory. I tipped the mag light to catch the motion and watched one screw turn half a rotation by itself before stopping. I pressed that little gray putty back without thinking and it molded to the hole like skin. The humming did not return, but something remained in the air. A pressure like the held breath of a person in the dark who doesn't want you to know they're there. I stood and the beam of the light shook in a way I couldn't blame on my hands. The bell rang. Not the big stand in the old section. Not the little cup I could see from where I stood. This was the bell inside the mausoleum. The one above the door that we never use, a soft service bell hardly anyone notices. It gave a single clean note, a please look up from a hotel counter. I turned toward it and felt the key in my pocket press against my thigh with a weight that didn't match its size. I stepped inside again and found nothing changed. The plaques waited. The little table for flowers in the entry had a plastic cup turned upside down on its surface, the way I leave it to keep dust from collecting inside. I lifted the cup and the underside was wet, a perfect circle of water catching the light. The ceiling above that table was dry. I wiped the circle with my sleeve and put the cup back down. Under it, the wood was dry again, as if I had imagined the wet. I checked the names. Cora with the 2 different birth years. The newer entry had changed. The bolder ink was still there, but the numbers matched the other now. I stepped back to make sure I was seeing what I was seeing, and hit my shoulder against the doorframe. The bell above me shivered and rang twice, smaller than the first note, like a breath. There are points in a night where your body makes the choice for you. I walked to the watch house. The drizzle didn't let up, and somewhere water had started to run from a downspout that always delays. The path along the lower loop was slick, and the lamps made halos I passed through, each one briefly warm. The logbook was open to the page I'd signed earlier. My name was on the line above the one I remembered. Same hand, same signature. The timestamp was 8:12 p.m., almost an hour before I arrived to sign. I touched the ink. It didn't smudge. I closed the book carefully and opened it again to a different page. The torn sheet I'd seen earlier was whole. The story about the Pennsylvania bell was clipped neatly inside the back cover, same place it always lives, except someone had underlined with a ruler the last sentence about the grave belonging to a boy buried in 1903. The underline was too straight to be a human hand. I sat, the chair complaining in a way that made the shed settle around me, and took stock like you do when you have to write an incident report no one will understand. The brass key was heavy in my pocket. The wedge, 2 pieces of same pine, were wet in the other. I could make a grid of facts, door wedged twice. Wedge duplicated, key found, key fit something it shouldn't. Screws seated by themselves, bell rang. Radio spoke one simple word in a voice I might or might not know. Ledger entries behaved as if I had seen them wrong. Practical tools, practical steps, sensible observations that added to something impossible only when you allowed yourself to stack them. I made one more round. The rain relaxed to a mist that made the sodium lamps hum faintly. The old bell stand in the lower section looked indifferent, rope hanging straight, not darker than the lay. The grave with the swapped plate. I wiped my sleeve over it. The month was corrected to April. The damp patch in the soil had widened to the size of a coat and a half. I set the mag light on the stone and crouched. The soil did not give under my fingers. It only looked wet. It was dry as ash an inch down, warm where the rain should have cooled it. I cannot tell you that I felt danger I could point to. I can only say I felt watched in a way that didn't feel like a thing wanting to be seen, but a thing wanting to be exactly where it was without interruption. I set the wedge on the chapel step. I slipped the brass key into the empty tray that holds tags for temporary vases. I clicked the radio on and on again to hear the hiss. No word came out of it now. I locked the gates in order, the chain links wet and heavy, and the last one resisted like it had a knot in it. I forced it, listening to each link note in the night. I slept in the watchhouse chair from 3 until just before 5. My dreams were the simple kind that repeat a task. In mine, I turned a key and a door opened to heavier air. When I woke, the sky was a gray that isn't morning yet. Only the idea of morning. The drizzle had thinned to a fine motion that made everything glisten. I made coffee with the little plug-in machine we keep under the shelf. The first swallow was metallic. I poured it in the sink and ran the tap until the water stopped tasting like it had already passed through a pipe too many times. Dawn made the fog glow. I went to the mausoleum steps one last time because I needed to know if anything I'd done had left a mark. The putty caps were smooth where they had been. I pressed one and it held print. The humming wasn't there. The bell didn't ring. The chapel's brass lock turned as it always does. The wedge I'd left was gone. The brass key waited exactly where I'd set it in the tray. Dry now, light, as if I had imagined the weight. That was the relief. That soft letdown of looking for a mess and finding order. I walked the path to the outer gate road. Listened to the city start its slow morning, car tires on wet, a bus brake sighing. The air smelled like leaf mulch and old pennies. I wrote my notes in the log. I put the key in a plastic bag with a brief description. I turned off the radio. I took one last look down the main path where the lamps were switching off in order, each going dim with a tiny pop only you can hear when you're standing close. When Dennis came in, tapping his lighter without thinking, he frowned at the bagged key. "What's this?" "Found it by the chapel window," I said. "Didn't match anything." "Fit something else," he squinted. "Looks like one of the old crypt keys from the downtown supplier. We never used those. They got recalled for bad shoulders. Why?" "No reason," I said, and felt the heel of my hand ache where the stone had pressed it. I left at 6. I should have gone home and slept. Instead, I sat in my car with the engine off and the window fogging and watched the front path. Marla arrived at 6:20, wiping her glasses before she even stepped out of her car. She let herself in, looked tired, then turned back to me like she'd forgotten something. She held up the logbook and I saw my name on the line for 8:12 p.m. again. "You signed twice," she called. "Just sign once tonight?" "It confuses the audit." "I only signed once," I said. She tilted her head, wiped her lenses and went inside. When I got home after the shower that didn't warm me, I pulled my coat off the chair and the brass key fell from the pocket to the floor. I picked it up and found a smear of the gray putty under my nail I would have sworn I'd washed away. The key should have been in the bag in the watch house. My hand closed around it and I felt, not heard, something in the memory of my palm answer from far away. From a set of wet, familiar steps the city will walk past all day, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. What do you think of this story? Tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were there. I read every single one of your thoughts, and some of them stay with me longer than I'd like. Now let's move on to the next story, because what's coming next might be even darker. Soil sighed somewhere to my left, a low settling sound like a bag of sand being dragged over stone. I turned because the sound was close, and in the same second a sodium lamp hissed, brightened, and threw the leaning row of headstones into a flat yellow plain that made every drop of drizzle stand out. I felt the wet through my jacket cuffs and the cold climbing into my wrists. I had my mag light in my palm and the Motorola clipped to my chest. I'm the night caretaker at St. Bridget's Cemetery on the north edge of town, and this happened during my last week on the job. It was a Tuesday in late autumn, and I had taken the extra shift because Eddie traded me for Friday. He said he didn't like being here near Halloween, then laughed and tapped his lighter against his knuckles as if to say he didn't mean it. He always did that when he was uncertain. I told him I didn't mind the quiet. The drizzle had been on since dusk. It's the kind that doesn't look like rain, only hangs in the air and finds seams in your clothes. The ground here goes soft early, slick over clay. I did the rounds like always. Watch house first, logbook signed, keys checked on the brass ring, map folded and refolded. The radio check with Maris, the day supervisor, came back in her usual clipped voice. She wipes her glasses 3 times every time she has to read a number out loud. She said, "Gate 1 secure, Gate 2 secure, chapel closed, mausoleum closed." I repeated it back and headed out along the inner road around the chapel. At the rear, behind the weeping ash that's dying from the borer, there's a section we call Old Parish. The stones there are close and thin, and the dates run from 1887 through just after the war. I stopped because there was a new patch of dark, damp soil halfway down a row, even though it hadn't rained hard in days. I pressed my boot to it and water pooled up through fine gravel. There was no depression, no digging, just wet where all around was merely slick. I wrote it in the log I keep in my pocket. Damp soil under partial cover. No smell, no footprints. It was small, and small things make sense by morning most of the time. Near the chapel, the bell rope that runs up through the rafters to the old bell was moving. I keep that rope tied back because kids sometimes pull it and wake the neighborhood. The knot was still in place. The rope swayed like a pendulum, no more than the width of my fingers. The door was locked. The wind was too weak to push anything inside. I stood there with my hand close to the rope and felt nothing in the air, just cold. I told myself the building breathes when the air changes and walked on. When you say something like that out loud, it becomes truer in your head. At the main gate, I checked the padlock. It was locked with our lock. I checked the side gate by the caretaker shed. Also locked. When I reached the outer gate road at the east perimeter, the small pedestrian gate we often leave propped open for the florist in the morning was secured again, chain wrapped, our tag threaded. I hadn't locked it. I looked in the watch house log to confirm. The last entry, Maris at 1610, said, "Leave East Ped Gate propped for florist delivery 070. I wrote beneath it, "Gate found secured 2132. Relocked by whom unknown." I keyed the Motorola. Maris was in her car heading home. She said maybe Eddie locked it on the earlier round. He hadn't. Eddie is the kind who leaves notes with arrows and underlines. When I passed the maintenance shed, the smell of petrol and moss mixed in my nose. The steel trimmer was still on its hook where Eddie left it after edging the chapel path. The Fisker's shovel we share stood with clay dried around the lip from a grave adjustment earlier. Everything was where it should be. I wiped the shovel with a rag because that's one of my useless habits. I hate clay drying on steel. I turned to the ledger to mark the spares and noticed a page folded in at the corner. It was the interments list, handwritten by me 2 days earlier. A grave in Section C, Plot 42, had a burial date of the 24th. It was the 21st. My own handwriting. Same pen, the same small looping 4 I write. I stared at it and counted. The numbers were right in sequence. The date was simply wrong. I added a line in the margin and corrected it. Then I looked at the previous page and saw the same name, same family, listed again but with the correct date. It wasn't a duplicate entry that happens by fatigue. It was as if the page had been filled twice with a slight shift in time. I closed the ledger and told myself I'd copied from an older draft without noticing. It's easy to lie to yourself when you are alone and need to be efficient. By the mausoleum, the air gets colder because the stone holds the day and then throws back a chilled breath. The steps are shallow and blackened from hundreds of shoes. The rain makes them sound like a quiet drum. I heard something beneath them. I have no better way to say it. It was a hum that seemed to come from the stone, not the air. I crouched and held my maglite sideways to reduce the reflection off the wet risers. Nothing moved. The hum was thin and at the edge of hearing like a generator 2 streets away, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I stood there long enough to make my knees ache. The sound faded when I shifted my weight and came back when I relaxed. It reminded me of when you hold a seashell and convince yourself you can hear the ocean. That made me laugh once into the wet air. The laugh sounded sharp like metal. The rest of the round brought smaller things. The lantern in the watch house wouldn't stay lit if I set it down on the desk. It burned fine when I held it. Twice it guttered and went out when I placed it in the exact center of the blotter. When I moved it to the corner, it held. I took that as a draft coming from the window. I checked the window and it was latched tight. The Motorola gave me static that shaped itself into a syllable while I was logging the gate anomaly. It sounded like a clipped word repeated twice. I played it back. If there's a recording of that, it would be me standing with my head bent to the speaker repeating what I thought I heard. The word down. I wrote that in the small pad I carry for trivia. Static may have said down. Ridiculous line to write, and yet it felt important. Names started to repeat. Not in succession, but in my path. On the east side of Old Parish there is Burn. Multiple stones because half the neighborhood had that name in those years. What caught me was the same given name, Kieran, on 3 stones separated by 30 years. A child from 1911, a man from 1943, a man from 1975. It isn't impossible. It isn't even rare, but the spacing put a small stone in my stomach. On the inner road by the beech hedge, the name O'Hare came up twice with the same death date 60 years apart. The older stone was restored recently. The newer one was still clean. I told myself families reuse dates for remembrance. I told myself anything that took the quiet down a notch. Around midnight, I took shelter in the chapel doorway to drink from the thermos. The chapel interior is simple. Plain pews, a short nave, wood darkened with age. The statue of Bridget near the front is always colder to the touch than the pews. I put my palm to it every round to convince myself of nothing in particular. The rope in the corner swung again. The knot knocked the wall lightly. It made a note like a spoon on a cup. I stepped in enough to set the rope still, and then saw the brass key on the front pew seat far left. I know that key. It's the one that doesn't fit anything on sight, the one we still keep because it came on the ring decades ago, and none of us have the heart to throw it away. Old brass stamped with a number that doesn't match any lock. It is smooth and warm from the oils of hundreds of hands. It should have been hanging on its hook in the watch house. I took it between forefinger and thumb and felt the grooves. There is a nick on the head where it once fell between stones and Eddie had to fish it out with a bent coat hanger. I put it in my pocket and told myself Eddie left it there by mistake to test me, because that's the sort of joke he thinks is funny. When I did the outer road again, the pedestrian gate that had been locked was propped open with the small wedge we use. I stood there for a full minute listening to the hedge drip. The wedge had been under the watch house desk in the drawer with the blotter paper. I let the gate be propped, because that's what the log said the morning needed, and I went to the watch house to see if the wedge-shaped gap in the drawer looked like it had been there a while. It was clean wood. I can't explain why that mattered, except that it made me feel like I was following someone, 2 steps behind and seeing where they had lifted objects and moved them just enough to make my future path straighter. The second hour I passed the mausoleum again. The hum was louder and not constant. It rolled in and out like the low end of a song, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I said that to myself without meaning to, like a note being read out in my head instead of thought. I pressed my hand to the lower riser. The stone was colder but no vibration. I put the brass key on the riser for a second to see if metal on stone would make any new sound. It made none. When I picked the key up, a rush of cold air went across my knuckles as if a vent had opened. There is no vent there. At 1 a.m, Maris radioed to ask if I had switched the log format. The system automatically syncs entries, and she was home checking a discrepancy on the burial dates because a family had emailed. I told her about the incorrect date and the duplicate entry. She wiped her glasses and spoke slower, the way she does when she is thinking. Copy the lines as they appear to a paper note. Do not edit the ledger again. Photograph the page with your phone. Email it to me. I did all that in the watch house, my jacket dripping on the mat. In the photograph, the page looked normal, until I zoomed in and saw my correction line had been written twice, the second time fainter, and at a slightly different angle as if my hand had trembled while writing it. And I hadn't. I took another photograph. In the second photograph, the correction line was a single line. I looked up and tasted metal in my tongue like I'd put my mouth near a battery. Back on rounds, the lantern on the desk went out. I relit it and held it to the window's latch to check again for a draft. The flame pulled sideways, not toward the window, but toward the door. Outside on the path, the fog had thickened along the ground so that the headstones floated like they were pressed into cotton. I could hear water ticking off the gutters at the chapel, and the thin breath of wind lifting dead oak leaves and dropping them. The radio gave one burst of static that sounded like a tapped microphone. Then down. I said into it, say again. Nothing answered. I walked with the brass key in my hand because I had the feeling I would drop it if I kept it in my pocket. By the chapel, the bell rope was still. At the rear of the chapel, a narrow stair leads down to a small storage room where we keep extra candles and altar clothes. I don't like the stair because it is blind and the lower door is old oak that swells in damp. The key to that door is a square shaft iron thing the size of my hand. The brass key has never fitted there. I tried it because it was in my fingers. The brass key slid in and met a tumbling resistance that felt like teeth that knew the shape. It did not turn. I pulled it out and the whole stair seemed to draw a breath. I hate that that's the sentence I have to write, but that is how it felt. At 2:15, I found Eddie's cigarette tucked behind the notice board nail near the watch house door. He knows I don't like the smell, and he hides one there as a joke sometimes. I roll my eyes and throw it in the bin. Tonight it had a smudge of wet clay on the filter. Eddie hadn't been on site since afternoon. The clay looked like our exact clay. When I lifted it with a tissue, I saw a hair stuck to the filter, fine and gray like a thread from a sweater. I dropped it because this job teaches you to drop things you don't understand. I made myself do what we are paid to do. I went to the far boundary, to the temporary fencing by Section E where a new row had been cut last month. The light out there is bad. The lamps cast long orange cones and the fog holds them at eye level. I stepped where the gravel is newer and crunch is different. A shape passed between two stones ahead and I raised my maglite. It was just rain creating a curtain. I could smell wet grass and cut cedar. Then the radio hissed and said down in the same flat tone and died. The hum met me like a wall on the third pass by the mausoleum, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. It had grown from a background thing to a felt presence. Standing on the top step made my teeth fuzz like I'd bitten foil. I angled the light along the seam where the stair meets the base. You can slide a thin card in that seam in summer. Now water filled it. The sound came in pulses, and in each pulse there was a suggestion of other sounds within, like voices sung far away. But that description is wrong because as soon as you say voices, your brain looks for words. It wasn't words. It was the way an empty hallway forgives certain frequencies and makes them louder. I tried the brass key on the mausoleum door, even though I knew the lock is a modern cylinder and the key is not. The key turned in my hand like it wanted to teach me a shape. My glove squeaked. I pulled the glove off and put my fingers on the metal. It was warm now from my hand and from the weird life of brass. The hum pulsed, and in the pulse my ribcage vibrated. It felt personal, like when someone says your name from behind and you know it's for you even before the words make sense. At 3, the rain picked up. You can tell because the sound on the chapel roof changes from tick to a constant whisper. My jacket was soaked to the elbows. I took the Fisker's shovel from the shed because I could not think of anything else to do that was not panicking. I went to the patch of damp soil in Old Parish, the one that had made the little pool when I stepped on it. The water now filled a shallow circle the size of a plate. I set the tip of the shovel in the edge and pressed. The clay gave no more than expected. The shovel made the dull metal on soil note that I hate. I set the shovel aside and stood listening. The hum was behind me, not here. I can be slow to stop when an idea has hold. I walked back to the mausoleum and stood the shovel against the handrail. The shovel rang with a note as if it had been struck, but I hadn't touched it. The hum then paused like someone had taken a breath. Inside the watch house, I checked the ledger again because it became the only solid thing. The date I had corrected had reverted and then corrected again in a way that made my eyes ache. The lines were there, then not. I held the page to the light and saw indentations from handwriting that didn't match mine, larger with a rightward slant. The name on that indentation was one I had not entered anywhere else. Colum O'Rahilly. I know that name from a stone near the gate. He died in 1982. The indentation showed today's date next to it. I looked at the clock. I looked at the window. The lantern flame pulled toward the door again. The room smelled like brass, which is to say, like rain that has gone through copper pipes. It happened in the next hour, and I am going to write it as plainly as I can. The hum built until I felt it through the soles of my boots. It pulled me out of the watch house because that is where it was strongest. Not because I was curious or brave, but because the body moves to settle the difference between what you are feeling and where you are standing. The sodium lamps along the inner road flickered once in a string pattern left to right, like a ripple of orange. I never like how they do that because it makes the space feel measured by someone else's rule. I walked with the maglite beam shaking slightly, not from fear but because my arm was cold. I walked past the chapel where the bell rope hung still, and the knot left a small damp mark on the white wall. I walked past the beech hedge where the leaves were black and heavy. I walked to the mausoleum steps and set my boot on the top one. The hum became a tone that had a scale. It climbed a note as I took the second step. On the third, it stopped completely and left a hole in the air. In that hole, I could hear the rain on the grave covers to my right and the drip off the iron railing to my left. The brass key was in my hand because I had been holding it without noticing. The key felt heavier. I set it on the top step and the tone resumed in a lower pitch like a chest voice answering a head voice. I picked the key up and it stopped again. I did this 3 times because repetition is a comfort. The steel trimmer in the shed clicked once on its hook like plastic contracting. The radio on my chest whispered a shape of static and died. I turned the shovel around and used the handle to tap the stone of the step. Solid. I angled the maglite down the side where the stairs meet the base. Water had pooled along the edges and it reflected the beam back in a way that made the edges look like they doubled. I crouched. The air was metallic, thin, and the cold had the clean taste of a refrigerator. The tone pressed closer to my ear like pressure before thunder, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I remember thinking it like a report I would have to give someone. I set the brass key again on the top step. I held my hand above it. You can feel heat off metal that has been near a lamp. This was not that. This was the absence of cold. A small round pocket the size of the keyhead that had no temperature. The tone opened like a throat. I did not run. That is important to me for reasons I won't understand until much later. I stood up slowly because my knees were stiff and because the whetstone worries me. I slid the key into my pocket deliberately because my hand wanted to drop it. I took the shovel by the midshaft and planted it in the wet gravel so that it would not slide. I took the handrail. I stepped back one step. The tone followed one step later like an echo that was not sound but attention. I took another step down. The tone leaned in again. The bell rope inside the chapel knocked the wall once, hard enough to make a real dull note. A car passed on the road beyond the hedge and threw a smear of white light through the fog. My breath came white and even. The tone said down not with words but with a shape the same as the radio had made. The climax of whatever this was is small when described. I took the brass key out again because my hand could not leave it alone. I set it against the seam of the lowest step where the mortar is recessed. The key found purchase against nothing and held there as if a magnet had it. The tone thinned into something like breath in a bottle. I turned the key a fraction like you do when you test an unfamiliar lock. The step under my boot shifted no more than the width of a fingernail and dropped back. In that motion, water in the seam shivered and shot down like it had a place to go. The tone slid down a note and I felt a moving absence beneath the stone like someone had pulled a tray along rails. The shovel made its own small noise even though I was not touching it. The maglite beam jittered on the blackened riser and caught a hairline of darker black where no line should be. My mouth filled with the taste of copper. I counted to 5 because that's what I do when I need to pause and not panic. I don't know how long I stayed there, long enough that the rain changed weight twice. When the tone finally ebbed, it did not stop. It curled back into the stone like a tide going under. I eased my foot sideways because I imagined the step would fall in and take me with it, even though there is no shaft beneath. I know the plan of this building. There is earthfill and then a void under the center, but not under the steps. The key came free when I lifted it and left a dry shadow on clean wet stone the shape of the head, which lasted 1 second and then erased itself with cold. When I went back to the watch house, I found the logbook open to a page I had not left it on. The handwriting was not mine, but it was neat, rightward slanted like the indentations I had seen. It read, "Chapel open for vigil 0340, close at dawn." The time on the clock was 0317. My signature was beneath it, accurate to the tail of the G in my surname. I put my hand on the page and my palm picked up a ghost of ink. I flipped the page back and saw my own earlier entry about the gate. Only this time there was an added line initialed M for Maris saying, "Confirm florist access." That line had not been there. I took my phone to photograph it and the battery showed red at 9%, then died to black. I decided, because anyone would, to be done. Dawn comes late, but it comes. I wiped the shovel again because the rag was in my hand. I hung the lantern on its hook and left it already lit to prove something about drafts. I checked the chapel once more externally. The latch was in its place. The bell rope hung quiet. The hum was faint enough now that it might have been the transformer in the lamp. When I passed the mausoleum, I did not step on the top riser. I kept to the gravel. The brass key in my pocket weighed like it could pull my belt down. Early light is not warm here. It is a gray that tries to flatter whetstone and fails. Birds came back to the hedge. Tires began out on the road. I walked along the outer gate road to check the wedge and found the pedestrian gate closed, chain threaded, our tag hung. The wedge was on the ground inside the hinge. I stood there and watched my breath and told myself I had done that and forgotten. When I turned back toward the watch house, Eddie was coming up the path with his hood up and his lighter out, tapping it against his fingers. He said he couldn't sleep and figured he would come early. He stopped when he saw me and said, "You look like the stone." He meant my face. He grinned because he thought that would fix it. We did a quick round together because that is what you do. You drag the day into the night and prove that it holds. He talked more than usual, about the borer in the ash and the new blade on the steel and the florist who always brings the wrong invoice. In the chapel, he reached to touch the statue of Bridget and pulled back his hand quick and said she was colder than the wood, which made him laugh. He set the lantern in the center of the blotter on the desk in the watch house and it held steady. He said, "See, just a draft." He picked up the ledger and flipped and then stopped at his own name on a page from last winter. and tapped it with the lighter. I took the lighter from him without thinking and put it down on the desk. The brass key slid out of my pocket when I leaned and landed with a sound like a coin. Eddie said, "You found the mystery key." I told him I had picked it up in the chapel. He shrugged because for him nothing belongs anywhere, it just stays near where you last needed it. Maris came in near 7, wiping her glasses. She looked at the log. She asked about the date discrepancy and I told her exactly what I saw. She told me to go home and sleep, and not to enter anything else until she spoke with the office. She said I looked pale. I signed out with the time in the box and I did not read the line above it that already had my name and my handwriting signed out at that same time. I did not read it then, I read it later when I came back after lunch because I couldn't let it alone. At lunch I went to the sink and drank water that tasted normal and tried not to think about brass. When I returned in daylight, people were in the cemetery. An old woman with a cane, a man with 2 bouquets, a groundsman from the city checking the perimeter fence. The mausoleum steps in sunlight looked exactly like stone, like nothing. The seam where the water had been was dry. I pressed my hand there and felt cool and nothing else. In the watch house, Maris had left the ledger closed. I opened it. My sign outline was there exactly as I remembered writing it, and beneath it a mirror of the same line, same time, same signature tail. Maris had annotated in red along the margin, "Duplicate line printed, see me." It looked like a printer error, except printers don't work on bound paper and pens do not make duplicates. I looked at the brass key on the hook where it belonged and saw moisture ringing its shape on the paint, a round watermark like a halo that ought to have evaporated but hadn't yet, as if the key had been set there from underwater. I told myself to let it be. I told myself I would finish my last shifts and then move on. That night when I lay down, I kept hearing a low tone under the room noise, under the hum of the refrigerator, under the heater's breath. I put my hand under the pillow where I keep my phone when I don't want to think. My fingers found the weight of the brass key instead, although I knew I had left it on the hook in the watch house. I turned the light on and there was nothing in the bed. The tone went away when the light came on and returned when I closed my eyes. I slept enough to dream nothing. I went back the next night on time because I don't call off. The rain was lighter, more like a mist. The first thing the space gave me was quiet. The second was the small shift of air at my knees when I mounted the first step of the mausoleum. I stood there with my hand on the railing, hand getting wet from the droplets that cling to metal, and made the promise you make to nobody in particular. One more round and then home. One more see and then done. I lifted the mag light and laid the beam low across the risers the way I had the night before. The light made a thin stripe. My breath made a cloud. Then my body knew the sound before my ears did. A vibration that made the small bones in my ear and the bridge of my nose tense as if they were listening. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. What do you think of this story? Tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were there. I read every single one of your thoughts and some of them stay with me longer than I'd like. Now let's move on to the next story, because what's coming next might be even darker.